All right, so this is what we are talking about. There's a pause.
Yeah, there's like a 1 second delay.
Yeah, all right, that's fine. So here is the cycle of speech processing. Can I really hear me well, people? All right, perfect. So we have the production side, which is when the sorry, let me just get adjusted to this delay. It's very
Yeah, just look at your laptop's better.
all right. All right, so we have the production side, right? So you have your brain that is sending kind of signals to the muscles in the vocal tract, and they basically start the coordinated movement of the lips, the jaw, the tongue, and all of these different articulatory organs that they basically produce a pattern of vibration, right? They change the sound that is coming out of your mouth, and this vibration then reaches a person's ears. And when that happens,
What's that picture in the middle?
in the middle is just a wave propagation in the air. Yeah, it's actually for some two speakers talking, so this is not a fake one. It's actually two talkers talking simultaneously. And then you have the eardrum that that vibrates, and there are these three bones that connects it to the cochlea. So if you look at the ear a bit more closely, we have the outer ear, and we have the eardrum, and we have this that is then transduced. This mechanical vibration is transduced to the cochlear, just a spiral-shaped bone here, and this is basically a mechanical frequency analyzer. All right, so different parts of this the cochlea have different resonance frequencies. So when you have these vibrations at different frequencies that come to you, different parts of this starts to vibrate. Okay? And this mechanical vibration are then transduced to spikes via these special neurons that are called the hair cells. So these are the cells that have hairs, and there are these basically tiplings, tiny things here that are opening and closing these mechanical ion channels. Okay, so as these vibrates and go back and forth, when they're on one end, the channels are open, ions are coming in, spikes are generated, and they go to the other way, they close. Right, so this is how the mechanical vibrations are transmitted into spikes. And you have these basically 20,000 of these inner neurons in the cochlea. And so in the cochlea, we know pretty well what it does and how it does it. So you have a time frequency representation of the signal in the cochlea that then travels through multiple stops, cochlear nucleus, superior olive, midbrain, until it reaches the auditory cortex. And the numbers that you see here are roughly the number of neurons that exist in that area. So yeah, so it's very deep. It has multi-layers, and you have this massive expansion of the number of neurons. And of course, that's not the end, and there are other parts of the brain that are also involved in this speech and audio and sound processing. There are areas that are involved in speech perception, some involved in speech production, some involved in integration with other modalities like audiovisual areas. And if we just look at the first one, the first stop was the cochlear nucleus. And the types of neurons that you see there and the way they respond to a very simple stimulus, let's say a very short tone. All right, so you have neurons that respond, you have this ramp down, you have this ramp up, you have the onset neurons, you have, so basically this just tells you that even at the very first stage, we have all kinds of different nonlinearities that are applied to the sound, right? And this is the first stop before it goes to the cortex.
And is it fair to say there's like also sustained and transient pathway here? Like, is it broadly split into sustained and transient or not?
Yeah, I mean, you have some neurons that basically are just caring about the transient, for onset, offset, and you have some neurons that are, they fire through. Yes, so there are both kinds. All right, so so one of the problems that we are interested in many different disciplines is this transformation of sound to meaning, right? Which is like what you're doing right now. Like I'm producing all this noise, and somehow this noise is hopefully is carrying some meaning for you. And this is a problem that has been studied in psycholinguistics for many decades. And what they are interested in is to figure out how the words are formed in a language, right? So when you're listening to all these different sounds, what is the process of putting them together into words? And there are many, many different models. I believe this one is trace model. Yeah. Of course, the community of neurophysiologists are very interested in this problem to figure out what are these areas that are involved, how are they connected, how is it the information about the sound transformed into, as it travels through this pathway. And obviously, this is also a problem that we are trying to recreate in machines, right? And now we have all, so 20 years ago, this really sucked. And so that's like one change since then, not just maybe the short hair, but finally we have some really good, I would say, superhuman performance in many different tasks. All right, so how do we study this? There are many different ways that you can probe the neurons in the brain and get the responses. Two of them that we use in our lab are invasive and non-invasive methods. The invasive ones are in collaboration with neurosurgery departments and epilepsy patients. So these are the patients that are in hospital for 1 or 2 weeks for epilepsy, and they have electrodes are either as a grid on the surface of the cortex or penetrating electrodes. You could also do EEG, which is the thing that we have, and hopefully we will show today at noon. There is fMRI, obviously, that Sam and RJ have used a lot. They talk to them, and MEG, that Claire talked about the other day. All right, so with these sort of invasive methods that I showed you, what we are able to do is to get a pretty good view of the non-primary auditory cortex, superior temporal gyrus, STG, and also the primary part. So this was the part that when the sound comes from the midbrain, it reaches the cortex first here. And from there, it goes to other areas. It's debatable. People argue that there are other pathways for it to reach the cortex. It's not just the but that's like the general, we generally call this the primary auditory cortex, and that's the secondary areas.
Is that looking down on the brain? Yeah. Dorsal is up, right? Dorsal is up.
Dorsal is up, yes. All right, so what do we see? So if we have, let's say, one of these patients, now this is a cross-section that you're looking at now, this part of the cortex, the primary, so this is now the STG here, facial gyrus, planum temporalis, so 3 of the areas that are highly involved in sound processing. So if you look at how they respond as a person is listening to speech, this is the kind of a movie that you get. So each dot here is one electrode that was recorded with these depth electrodes, right? And this person is listening to speech, and you have these different patterns of activity. Sometimes this one lights up, sometimes that one lights up. And this is really, and it will be the same if you have a DNN, right? If you would play speech to a DNN and look at one layer, you will see a movie like this. You see that some neurons are up, some neurons are down. And when we talk about encoding and decoding, we basically are talking about these problems that how do we basically characterize how the information of the sound is transformed into the neurons. If you look at one of those neurons that I just showed you, how what is it about the input that activates it? And there are many different methods that people use to answer that question. One of them is the stimulus response mapping, which you basically try to find a function that maps the stimulus to the response. Okay? And this function could be a simple function like a linear ridge regression, or it can be a very complex function. If you know something about the stimulus, for example, in speech, we know a lot about what speech is and what are the units of speech, right? So if you know those, you can also try to see, to basically look for the representation of those particular features. That's another method, another class of, ways that, people
How is
study.
it different than this F? How is this feature representation different than this F of S?
Well, it doesn't try to directly say how your stimulus, what is the function that maps it to the response, but it's more like your stimulus has these sort of features. I'm going to look at these features and see how they change as you go through different areas. Like, are some of them disappearing? Like there's a normalization across dimension 1 and explicit representation across feature 2.
There are probably other representations which are not shown in the brain, like I don't know, syllables or something like that.
Yeah, so we get to that.
Yeah.
I have some examples of that. Yeah. And you could also, say that, ideally you want to have something that is independent of any model, independent of any feature, right? And tries to capture the responses in a way that doesn't depend on these assumptions. And we have also the decoding problem, which is if I give you that movie, what can you tell me about what the sound was and what the person was trying to do, right? Because now you have the mix of two. So you have the bottom-up sound that are coming in, and you have the person who's trying to do something, right? So maybe sometimes you're trying to listen to the sound, maybe sometimes you're trying to, think about something else. So this sort of thing, the decoding problem is to basically interpret the data and separate these sort of dimensions. So I'm hopefully going to go through all of these and give you examples of how we and others have tried to apply this to this problem of speech and sound representation in the cortex. We good so far? Excellent. All right, I'm actually making some progress, so that's good. I was very worried that I might get stuck on slide 10. And that's what I have here. Enforcement tool. All right, so let's look at the first one, this idea of mapping the responses. So we have a pretty good idea of what the cochlear is. So this is a model, this is Shihaw's model of the cochlear that basically tries to generate a picture, right? So if you hear a speech sound, this is the picture that is produced on the cochlear, right? And then the brain is looking at this 2D image. And when we go all the way to cortex, and let's say we record the responses from a particular area of the cortex, so traditionally, what people have tried to do to figure out how this is mapped to that, first, the first thing that comes to mind is to basically just model it as a linear filter. And that is this idea of defining a function, a 2D function that is shown here, that is basically convolved with your stimulus spectrogram and gives you the response. All right, so you can think of it as a convolutional, like a one kernel convolutional network, one layer, one kernel convolutional network. So this is called a STRF, a spectrotemporal receptive field. If you are working with something like EEG, it doesn't really have the resolution to separate the responses to different frequencies. So with EEG, we typically collapse all of this into just one power, right? This is the change in the power. And then this S disappears and becomes TRF. Right? So if you've heard of TRF, it's basically the same concept, it just doesn't have the 2D. And this becomes a one-dimensional, basically the impulse response of your system, right? It's easy to find it. You just have to look at, just minimize the mean square error between your predicted and actual response, and the answer is the cross correlation of your response and the stimulus normalized by the autocorrelation of the stimulus. So this is very simple, obviously, right? And I just showed you how many nonlinearities exist here at the very first stage. So this is a massive approximation, but it's useful, and it's very widely used. Like TRF is still probably one of the most if you look at the papers today, still use it a lot. And one reason is that it's very interpretable. So this is, this data is from Ferret. And here you see examples of these sort of filters. Here you see some neurons. So each of these is a neuron. Some of them look at very narrow range of frequencies, and some of them are looking across very broad range of frequencies. Some of them are looking for very fast changes in the input. Some of them are looking for very slow changes, right? Some neurons are tuned to sounds that are going up, and some are looking for more sensitive to the sounds that are going down, right? So this basically gives you a very nice view of the diversity of the tuning that you have. Correct?
Explain what you mean by scale here?
Yeah, a scale. I guess you can basically forget that name and just look at this column. You see, like this cell. If something happens in these frequencies here, it's blind. It doesn't see it. Like the window, the receptive field. These are receptive fields, right? So it basically, this receptive field is very narrow and looks just at a very narrow range of frequencies. This is an example of a high scale.
It just responds for a moment. I mean, this is not to a tone, right?
No,
a
natural sound.
Natural sound. And what does it mean that it's very short like that?
Well, it means that it doesn't care about what happened a second ago.
It's like
It's very local.
Okay. High pass.
It's what?
High pass filter. Or this.
So think this one is a high pass filter. Yeah, I can think of this one as a high pass filter. You know what I mean? But this one actually is more of a low pass because, right? It doesn't.
But it also stops responding after some time, right? Or The kernel has some, oh, I see, it only looks over a short time.
Yeah, if you look at the, let's say if you have an impulse response that is like 0 and then 1, 1, 1, 0, right? So it's like a moving average across 3 samples, right?
Okay.
It stops responding, it doesn't care about the history, but it's still a low pass filter.
And you know,
This is similar.
those neurons that you showed here are from the same region as your district cortex, or is there some?
These are all in A1 of ferrets. Yeah, this, yeah,
So the first stage in the cortex.
correct, yes.
And are they always balanced like this by construction or by in reality? Like
No,
these
these are examples, of course.
Okay.
Yeah, and I remember this saying from Shihab that whatever shape you want, I will find it for you.
Okay.
You can also have a random projection, right, with a different scale and rate and direction.
It could be a random projection.
Yeah, it could be random projection, right, with different scales and different rate and direction, right?
Yeah, yeah. I guess what it shows is that they exist.
Yeah, they exist.
Yeah, I'm not making any other claim. It's just that when you look at the diversity, you see that these are the dimensions that they
Correct.
vary across.
Correct.
And this was the motivation that for this spectrotemporal model that that many of the people here used to be the auditory group was working with that model. So
And which areas did you find them?
these are from the primary auditory cortex of ferrets.
For A1?
A1.
Yeah.
And this HTRF, you get these representations by testing, what do you call them, torques or something, like swipes across.
These are from torques, but you can also get the same thing if you do speech. Yeah.
Maybe you can explain torques though.
No, it's not important. No, it's yeah. Don't worry about it. We're gonna move on from ferrets.
One quick last question.
Yes.
Are the number of neurons of a particular type different for different types of responses?
Sure.
Who knows?
Yeah, these are ferret data. So Taishi had a paper.
Mouse does not have this.
Really? Yeah.
I mean, the mouse is far simpler and broader and so on.
Yeah. So let's look at them in humans.
Monkey has much interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting variety.
Sorry, the only reason I wanted to, because I guess ferrets nodes have some properties that
Yeah.
resemble the tones that you're establishing those maps on, as opposed to maybe mouse. So for their communication with each other, and if you've been around ferrets, you know that they vocalize quite complex sounds, right? So that might be why you didn't find.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so there is some basis on that. So let's move to humans, so we don't have to worry about medicine. Yeah. All right. So let's. So this was basically I'm trying to present encoding models, right? And this is one class of encoding model that tries to find the function from the input output. And obviously, if I ask anybody here, what's the problem with that model? It's that it's very simple. It's just a linear filter, right? But we like it. Why? Because it's very interpretable, right? Like then we just had a very nice conversation about all these different dimensions of the tuning, but just looking at these pictures. So yeah, so of course you can do something like this, do some neural network, make it super complicated and improve your prediction. But if you can't have that conversation afterward, then what's the point? So here is a work that tries to basically answer that. So now we want to have a very complex, arbitrarily complex neural network model that finds this F, but we want it to be as interpretable as that, like 100% as interpretable. All right, so how do we do that? So here is a convolutional network that is basically looking at the same window that the STERF is looking at. And yes, of course, you can get much better performance. Here is the linear correlations that you get from STERF. Here is the DNN correlation. So everything is on top, right? And especially for this improvement is higher for the higher areas of the cortex. Remember, STG was the secondary area, right? So when you get there, the deep networks also do something better. But here's the question, like, how do we interpret it, right? So we want to be able to look at these filters and say, oh, these are the dimensions that we see. So here we are using a network that the only constraint that it has is that, and it's actually another constraint, it works for everything, but it's basically a rectified ReLU node. So this network uses ReLU nodes. And so if what we can do, the nice thing about this nonlinearity is that if you are in the off phase, if the sum of the input to a node is negative, this node doesn't exist, right? It's off. If it's positive, then this node is basically just a linear function. So for a certain stimulus, for this particular window, what you can do, then you can go to your network and look at it, examine it. And you say, all of these nodes, they're off. So I'm just going to eliminate them. All of these nodes are in the on phase, right? So I'm just going to replace them with the unity function. And this whole thing basically becomes a bunch of linear weights multiplied together, right? Yeah, I mean, the other way of saying it is that I'm finding the the derivative of the output with respect to the input, right? So this is just a nice way of explaining it. It's very understandable. Yes.
Yeah, I guess what I was going to ask is there any reason you can't apply it to like any differentiable function? Or?
No. Yeah.
But you're requiring that condition be true during that whole period, right? You're requiring that all those units that are off during that whole period. So you're really restricted, right?
For that particular sample.
Yes.
Yes.
During that whole sample, all those units that are off have to be off.
So the duration doesn't. So this when I have a window on the input, right? So this window is one sample that's given to the network as a vector. So the network doesn't have a notion that there's time.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And then you shift your window 10 milliseconds, and now this is a new sample. So that's where the duration comes in. Yes.
Is that a likely outcome though? Because are you sparsifying your network weights initially when you do it? Because that's not typically how like a A&M would actually want to train itself. Like it would have multiple realizations of it, or if you had dropout, there'd be a lot more nodes on, so your off nodes would actually be very, very few, not many.
Oh, so this is during the training. This is during the inference.
Yeah. That's what I mean. During training, did you sparsify the weight?
No, there was no constraint. No.
So you're feeding this as a DNN, as a 1D vector, right? But in the 2D, you have a lot of this spatial relationship. How would you capture in this?
So if you have enough data, it should capture them from the correlation, right?
Okay.
And we can look at some examples. So this we just multiplied and we call it the new stirf or stirrup, right? And the property of that is that, so yeah, you can reformat this as the picture, the lag frequency, and now you have a nice picture that is as interpretable as the stirf, right? I can also show you some videos. So this actually shows how the stirf works also another way. So here's your spectrogram, and this is your stirf. It just basically multiplies that, sums over the frequencies, and you get the predicted response. Now, if you do the same thing with the DNN, for this particular node that happened to be pretty linear, you get a picture that's actually quite similar, right? It changes a little bit, but the main feature that it's trying to capture is the same. So it's able to capture that, what we saw there, right? But now the interesting thing is when you have nodes that are very nonlinear. And how do we know those nodes? Well, they perform much better for the DNN than the stir. So what happens for those? So we looked at, and yeah, by the way, that's why we call these, the name changes all the time, but now we call it the D stir, so dynamic stir.
Dynamic STRF.
Yes, yeah. And and we looked at this for many, we have hundreds of recordings, right? So we looked at all of these movies.
Humans now.
In humans, everything is in humans, yes. And we find basically we see that you can categorize the nonlinearities that you see into certain patterns. One of them is this thing that we call gain change. So it's the same feature, it just becomes more faint and more prominent over time. We have this very interesting nonlinearity that we call the temporal shift. So it's a certain feature, it's a very precise feature, right? But it changes, it shifts over time. So the network, basically the cell sees a feature and then it responds to it over time.
Is it like a sample and hold?
Something like that, yeah. Like a sustained response to a very particular feature.
It's a bit like in an LSTM.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, so you hold it and it release. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. But you see, this is an example of a nonlinearity. The feature itself is super temporally sharp, but you want to respond to it for a long time, right? And these two, you can't capture both with a linear filter. So with the linear thing, it will be smeared over time. But now you're able to do that. And we also see examples that we call them shape change, and there's no easy way to explain them. It's just, they're just nonlinear, depending on the input, what feature they respond to changes. And the interesting thing is that this first type of feature, if you look at primary, non-primary, there is no significant difference between them. But if you look at these other guys, they are much more non-primary.
Much more saying that.
In the non-primary, they are, you see higher. Yeah. All right, so here's a,
Any reason why do we see the lowest extreme and the upper extreme very close to each other? All of these. So there's a blue very adjacent to the red. There is a different and there is extreme. There is a reason why we see
oh, yeah, so that basically reflects the latency of the response, right? So how quickly this area that you're recording from sees the input. So yeah, and this area has short latency, and that's why they all pretty much start from close to the edge.
The question was, why
Yes.
is this pair of blue and red that is closely coupled together?
Oh, is that the, well, so that how close they are together, it basically determines the frequency of this. This is like high pass filter in a way, right? So it looks for a change in that particular frequency. It goes from low power to power, and how close they are together, it basically determines,
It's a differentiator.
yeah, but the frequency of that. This is,
It's high.
yeah, high pass. All right, so I might have to adjust what I will present. Running a bit out of time. All right, so this was the first class of the encoding that I wanted to show you, and the second class of the encoding is this idea of you can look at the features of the input, right, and try to see how these features are represented in the brain. And the reason we like that is that speech has been studied forever, right, and we know very well about let's see if the video and audio work. So these are the MRIs, real-time MRIs of people who are saying ah.
Asa.
Fricative sound. T touches there. When the person says T, the tongue touches the tongue, the T.
Ata.
And you have a nasal example here that we basically close the mouth, and we use a nasal cavity to produce the sounds like M, N, or ing.
Ama.
Right? So this basically just to say that these are basically examples of phonemes, right? And they've been studied a lot. People have looked at all of these things, and we describe them in different ways, how they are produced, what are their acoustic signatures. So we can do something similar. We can go to these sort of
Nobody likes snakes.
brain responses, an example response, right? And then we can phonetically transcribe it and see if the responses when a particular phoneme like saw happened is different from the responses to another time in the input when a phoneme like n happened, right? So in a way, looking at evidence of selectivity at this particular site responds better to one phoneme or the other. So if we do that, we get pictures like this. So each of these are one electrode in the human auditory cortex, in the STG. And what you see here is the average response of that electrode to all the phonemes in English language from continuous speech, right? Everything is
The x-axis time.
X-axis is time, yes. So what's interesting is that the first group responds to the plosive sounds, like the ta that I played for you, pataka. The second responds to the second class of phonemes, the fricative sounds, like sa. And these two respond to different vowels, low vowel and high vowel, like R versus E. And we also have a class, this electrode that responds to all the nasals. So again, the similar discussion that we have. So you have this dimension, right? So you have this variation across different phonemes. And of course, these are just 5 examples. But we can try to basically summarize them as a vector and then look at it for a much larger population. Okay, and that's what we do. And here is what we see. So now in this matrix, each line is one phoneme, each column is one electrode, and the darkness is how much that electrode likes that phoneme. And they have been grouped so that the phonemes that tend to produce the same response across many different electrodes are grouped together, and electrodes that tends to like the same kind of phoneme are grouped together. Clear?
And the darkness is just a reflection of the rate of the firing, or
Selectivity. How different the response is from other other phonemes. Yes, but is there selectivity for this particular phoneme? All right, and we can also rearrange this so to make it a little bit more readable and show it the exact same thing as articulatory features. Okay, so when you do that, it becomes very obvious that all of these blue electrodes seems to respond to all the plosive sounds. You have a fricative electrodes, group of electrodes, you have wobble electrodes, and you have nasal electrodes. So basically, as I'm producing these different classes of phonemes, right? So there are these parts of your brain that seem to respond to different classes, but create a nice representation of all those different classes.
Somehow they're co-designed.
Co-design, yes, yes. That's another direction you can take this. So that's interesting, but again, like I showed you the stir, and we said it's too simple. It's just linear, right? And for speech also, phonemes are just basically sound. And of course, there is a lot more after that. There is the probability that you put two different types of phonemes together. They call it phonotactics. You have the lexicals, so eventually they form a word, right? Like a cat. Now this particular sequence of phonemes means something, right? It's part of lexical.
Nima, are these electrodes arranged in an anatomical fashion like a tonotopic graph?
I'll show you. Yeah.
I'm sorry, but you're not reporting spiking rates, you're reporting NFPs or.
Correct, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and eventually you have the semantic representation, right? So, for example, like, a cat and a hat are closed in a phonetic space, right? But a cat and a dog are closer in a semantic space, right? So you have also this sort of a semantic representation that eventually emerges in the brain. So we want to be able to go beyond just phonetics and look at the entire thing. And one easy way to do that is to create representation of all of these different levels of abstraction and use something simple as ridge regression and try to predict the responses from them. Okay? So in this work, what we do is that we predict them from all of them, and then one by one, we replace them with a control stimulus. So for example, you have the prediction from the whole thing, and then you say, now instead of getting the semantic features from the English language, get it from the Spanish language. So they are still, correct, but they are not anymore, correct for this stimulus. And how much that would degrade your correlation accuracy, prediction accuracy, would tell you how important that feature was, how much it is represented in the data.
So why does that thing look like a scalar and the other ones look like multiple features? I'm sorry to slow you down a little bit.
It's okay.
Just to understand better, right? Why is
Yeah. So the details, there are a lot of details here that, like I said, what we talk about the semantic here is really the semantic surprise on this case.
Surprise?
Yeah, so based on what you heard before, how is this thing semantically predictable or not? If it's not, it gets a bigger weight. If it's completely predictable, it doesn't get a lot.
So you select that. You choose the representation of something that you're going to try to regress.
Yeah. It's mostly for practical reasons, because semantic representations are super high dimensional, right?
Okay.
And so it's mostly practical reasons that we try to capture something that we can work with, but also has the information about the semantic. All right, so some examples, electrodes again. So a bunch of them, we have to see here, maybe care about low-level features like phonemes, and then when you get to higher areas of the cortex, we see now, there's a representation of lexical features, semantic features. And we can do the same thing and try to group them together. So this is a similar kind of figure I showed you before. Again, now we have the electrodes, we have selectivity to phonemes, phonotactics, lexical features, semantic features. And, this interesting pattern emerges. So, one thing that's interesting that you see that the phonetic features are represented everywhere, right? So everywhere you look, they have this representation of the phonetic features. But also these pre-lexical and post-lexical features. So these are the features that are calculated without knowing the words of a language versus the features that are calculated after. That they're the word of the language. So this is how likely a particular sequence is. So these two are also quite different. And I guess the interesting thing, but is not very surprising, is that again, as you go to higher parts of the auditory cortex, these higher level features emerge. They're correlated with the distance from the primary area. They're correlated with the latency of the responses. And also, if you take this as just a representation and reduce it to 2 dimensions, so you can visualize it, and then color each electrode by where they are anatomically, your question, you see that there is definitely a very distinct pattern. Like the different electrodes in different areas, this nice separation, right? So they care about the way that they represent this information is different. So so that's basically an example of how in the encoding slide that I had, so this is the second category that you take a feature and you look at how it's represented in the brain, right? Which is slightly different from the first one.
Nima,
Yes.
in the linear regression case, the
Yes.
semantics actually emerge at the same time as the stimulus onset.
I didn't show any timing. Well, how do you know that?
On the x-axis is time, right? Not this
Which?
one, but the linear regression.
You're talking about this figure?
Yeah.
No, the x-axis is not time. It's phoneme. Yeah, it's not time. No, actually, your question is interesting, but no, I don't have the timing feature. Oh, here, yeah, with the timing. Just to very briefly show that it's not true. Let's actually show up later. All right. So, I mentioned one other encoding method that you don't assume a model, you don't assume a representation, and this is an example of that. This is the work of Sam. So here's a case that it's a very clever design of a stimulus that basically allows you to see how much of the history of something matters. Okay, so if you look at the response to the same thing, when something in the past was different, long time ago or just recently, right? And by changing that duration, you can basically look at how much is this area, this electrode, integrating over time. Right, so you're not assuming any features or any model, and this allows you to basically look at the integration windows of these sites, which is interesting, and you see also that you go from primary to non-primary, just the integration window, the amount of time that is reflected in the response is changing. Increases, yes. All right, great. And I just wanted to, because there are lots of interesting music here, I just wanted to show you also this recent work that we had that, this is not just about speech. I talked about speech all the time, but, you can do the same thing also with music. I don't know how many of you guys are familiar with this sort of music AI, generative AI stuff. Yeah, so it's quite fascinating. And, it's the same thing as ChatGPT, but instead of predicting the next word, it predicts the next musical token. And, you can do the same thing, get one of these models. Let me show you, by the way. So here is a video of one of these. This is from Google. Okay, so this is the music that they give it a short snippet, and then the right of it, the model writes it itself. So it's like if you prompt it with a few notes, and then the rest of it comes from the model. Sounds nice, right? And these things that you see are the attention weights. And I'm showing this just to tell you that, to basically predict this node, the model sometimes looks all the way back to the beginning, right? So there really is a very big notion of the context. One more example, this is the first 6 notes of Mozart.
Trained on Mozart too, right?
No, everything.
Yeah,
Trained on
but
everything.
it's seen Mozart, right?
Yes,
Okay.
but this is not a Mozart.
Right.
The Mozart never wrote this. You know what I mean? So it's
I
started with Mozart, but yeah. So here we are basically taking one of these models and looking at the representation of different layers of this model. Question?
Sorry, was what you played, was that generated or was that human generated?
No, the very first part of it, the first few notes are human generated.
Okay.
The rest of it is model.
So which part is the font?
For that one, I don't know. For this second one, it's first 6 notes. And every time you run it, of course, you get something different. So yeah, I think these models are really fascinating. And so here what we did is that we basically had invasive and non-invasive data from musicians and non-musicians as they listened to 10 Bach symphonies. And we basically looked at their representation in these networks. Here is, let me first show you what you see in this network. So here is the t-SNE. So it's a low dimensional representation of different layers of this network. All right, and each dot here is one note. And here is colored by the note identity. Here it's colored by the note duration. And here is colored by which of these 10 music pieces it came from. right? So, things are pretty much mixed here as you expect. Why would the piece matter? But as you go to the higher layers of the network, especially when you get to the end, now you see that these things become very separate. Like even the music, now you have these islands for different pieces of music, right? That all these notes are encoded in those areas.
Sorry, can you explain what you're doing here? Are you doing inference on your previous network or what's
Yeah,
going
so we're
on?
giving these music pieces that we have that we
Yeah.
play to people from Bach, and we are basically taking the activations of the network in different layers, and then we're reducing it to 2 dimensions using this.
Yeah.
And each dot here is one note.
The activations run over a long sequence?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Over from the beginning to whatever.
I'm going to
Each
change,
pass.
I'm going to vary that because it's a very interesting parameter that you can play with. But here is the interesting result that when you try to predict the responses from the musician and non-musician friends, they're not my friends. Some friends. I don't have any musician friends except Claire. So here are the layers, right? And for non-musician, for both of them, it goes up, right? But for non-musician, it plateaus pretty quickly. So if you're a non-musician, like you're as good as 8th layer of the network, perhaps. But for musicians, it keeps increasing, as you can see in the difference also.
You're projecting EEG from different layers of the artificial neural network, which is generating some music that they're hearing. Is that right?
Everything is correct except the last part. It's not generating in this case. We give it the music. It's like when you prompt GPT with something very long, right? So that is not generated, but the GPT has to encode it into the embedding. So if
You
you're taking,
take that ANN that's trained on a bunch of music,
yes,
then you measure the EEG when the people are listening to the music, then you try to predict the EEG from the neural network,
yes,
which was also seeing the same music.
exactly.
Okay.
And different layers of that, exactly.
Okay.
What features of the EEG are you correlating?
Oh, just the just the, I think it's low pass between 1 and 12 hertz. And that's it, just predicting the waveform.
The amplitude.
The amplitude, yes.
Compare this to non-specialist audio models that are specific to music, like Whisper or like just a wave-to-back model that isn't specifically to music.
Yeah, no, we haven't. Yeah, is it like just a representation or is it a prediction? That would be a good test. Yeah. And to Cornelia's question, we can also change the context, right? You can change the context of how much this network is able to see. And we see that, if you just give it 100 notes, the past 100 notes, then the musician and non-musician are not that different. But after you pass that, after you get to 200 notes and more, with that long context, then you see that the difference between musician and non-musician emerges. And in this case, by the way, it was very left-sided, and in this case, it's also left-sided. The difference between musician and non-musician, but it's also more frontal. Claire?
Those two differences are capturing a similar phenomenon of being able to take into account long-term dependencies.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. This one tests that more explicitly.
Yeah.
Right,
so
because
what
here-
do you interpret that? That was my question. My next question is,
Yeah.
what do you interpret? What do you make of these first results?
Yeah, so this, how do I make sense of it? So, so these models, when you go to the higher layers, I showed you that they are able to capture better representation of, more explicit representation of all the different dimensions. That could be one reason. It also could be the context, like they are able to look at the longer context. So this shows that context definitely is at least one dimension. That is, also we looked at those representations, and to get such nice differences, like for example, between the musical pieces, you need to have a long context. All right, so I'm going to speed up a little bit because I have some really cool things that I really want to show you guys. So this was the encoding. All right, so now let's move to the decoding, which is now, so you have something, and you basically you want to be able to infer something about either the stimulus or the state of the person. And this is the need for these sort of things. The people who have disabling hearing loss, is increasing every year. It's soon it will reach 1 billion people, right? So this sort of market, where it's like something that is like very much in need of help for people like. And BCI, I think many of you have experience with that. It's basically tries to capture some measure of the neural data and tries to either replace, restore, enhance, or supplement the function. Or you can also try to write something to the brain to treat, enhance, or alter something about the way that the person is perceiving, or maybe like there's a malfunction, like you're zapping a seizure. Or so this is a field that is I'm going to show you some examples. I have more examples. If we stay longer, I will show more. But for now, here is one really cool effect that might just good to see. So here's one patient that we had that when the clinicians were mapping the brain of this patient, what they realized is that every time they zap different parts, of course, they do that to figure out what part is important for language, what part is important for this other function, right? Because when they go and they try to cut a part of the brain, they need to know roughly where they should stop. Otherwise they will, they could create some behavioral deficit. So in this particular patient, every time they zap this particular area, this patient reported that all the noises disappeared. All right, and here's a video. Let me just ask. So she's going to tell you about her perception.
Okay, now I'm going to count to 10.
So we put together a test, a speech in noise test, but something that if you go to audiologists, they use that on you. And the intelligibility goes from like 50% to almost 100%. And the perceived quality also jumps a lot. So this is like really very strong.
Can you go back to what you are stimulating actually, just to show that picture?
Yeah, so this is in planum temporale, and the stimulation is basically just a 50 hertz. Nothing specific, nothing fancy. It's just a typical clinical
50 hertz.
50 hertz stimulation, yeah. Not matched to the stimulus or anything. It's just,
So it's the location.
location, yes. Yeah. So how, why is this? Yeah.
So this person didn't have any tinnitus or anything like that.
This is what?
This person didn't have any tinnitus or any other kind of.
No. Very high functioning, very good hearing. Yeah, just and that was not the location of the seizure, by the way. You could also try to map it back to the sound, right? So you have some neural recordings. You can say, can I reconstruct back what I heard? That's 10 minutes. Sure. Okay, so and here's an example. It's pretty bad, no? That was with the linear function and the new methods.
4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
Intelligible, right?
Sounds like a German.
See, like this is like somebody's talking to their cell phone on their cell phone, right? And you don't hear what they are listening to. You just see their brain waves, and then you can reconstruct back what they heard. So it's really amazing. And people now do it from the speech cortex. People who are unable to talk, and that really also really fascinating.
But on normal speech it works, or just on those digits? Just trained on the digits and.
No. This model never saw digits before.
Okay.
It's tested on digits and new speakers. Never saw these speakers, never saw digits. It just, it's trained on continuous speech. All right. And, so these are good. And when we talk about hearing loss and, people who have impaired hearing, of course, the noise is a very huge problem, right? And especially if you live in New York, like I do, there is really no place that you can have a quiet conversation with someone. And, as I'm sure many of you know, this is really the problem. This is the case that people with hearing loss suffer most. So, we had this study a few years ago, and we had, basically I was doing the same reconstruction, right? So we had these people listening to a blue talker, we reconstruct back the spectrogram. They listen to the red talker, we reconstruct the spectrogram. And then when you play them, let's say this speaker and that speaker, right? And then when you play them simultaneously, so now these two people are talking at the same time. The only difference is that the person is paying attention to one or to the other. Now what comes out of their brain very much resembles the spectrogram of that person in isolation, right? So as if the brain has filtered out the other sources. So what comes out of the brain, and if I put them on top of each other, you see that resemblance even better. Right? So this is really interesting. Like it shows a property of the brain that is able to filter the incoming stimulus. And later we looked at it in more detail. We saw, for example, that the primary areas of the brain don't really show that. They mostly care about who is talking, like speaker one is talking, and this area likes speaker one, so it responds to that. It doesn't matter what you want to listen to. But if you go to the higher areas, then it becomes very specific to your attention, right? So if you're paying attention to one person, this area responds only to that person. This is a more recent finding, which is really amazing. And somebody asked me a couple of days ago, so this is a response to that. Speech has a lot of natural pauses. So if two people are talking at the same time, they're going to have some times that they're overlapping and sometimes that they're not overlapping. When they're not overlapping, you get a clean view of the other speaker. They're called glimpse. All right, and if you get the glimpse phonemes in the primary area for both target and non-target, they are represented as well. If you go to the non-primary areas, yes, the glimpse phonemes are represented a little bit more, right? But all the other ones are still there too. So these are the clean views of the speech. Now, the really interesting thing is if you look at the masked parts of the speech. Okay, so these are the parts of the speech that was occluded by the other talker. And now those features in the primary areas are almost diminished. But when you get to the non-primary areas, you see that the very nice restoration of the phonemes of the mask of the target, the mask points of the target.
With the other person?
The one that you want to pay attention to. Yeah, just for that, right? For the unattended ones, you don't really care. And there is a nice timing difference between these two. So this definitely is something that requires more time, right, to be processed and restored. So there is a big difference between their timing. Also, anatomically, these happen in different areas. So these masked phoneme restorations happen in the different parts of the brain. All right, great. So let's talk about this thing that Malcolm mentioned in the first day, that these ideas then can be put into some use, right? They're not just basic science. So one idea here is that if you go to a cocktail party, this is actually very realistic. Like this is how we dress in Telluride. And if you go to Mountain Village, if you know the right people here, you might get invited to a cocktail party in Mountain Village, which looks like that. Shihab has been to plenty of these. All right, so if you pay attention to one conversation versus the other conversation, we want to be able to basically decode that from the brain and enhance that conversation so that it can help the person. And this is this idea of the brain control hearing device, that you have the sound sources, you have a way of separating them, you compare them to the brain of the person, and then you amplify the one that is most similar to the brain, right? And this is the problem that I think it was almost 10 years ago that we had the project here at Telluride, and a lot of people here worked on it. Back then, one part of this whole thing that we didn't know how to solve was this part, or the speech separation part, which we had no really good ways doing that. And that's why we spent also a lot of time designing better ways of doing speech separation. We have these, deep attractor network, TaskNet network, and let me just show you two recent work on that. This is one of them. It's this sort of next generation of audio processing engines that you basically have a mixture of audio that comes in, and then you're able to talk to your engine. You can say, remove the person talking in a low pitch and speed, make the guitar sound louder, extract the piano and the female's voice for me. You can basically say whatever you want, right? Any prompt that you want, you can tell it. And this engine is able to do that. So this, of course, is very interesting. But if you think about it from this AAD perspective, attention decoding perspective, it opens up new doors, right? Because now if we are able to decode this sort of concept from the brain, we can have entirely new class of AAD, right? Like if you can tell from the brain, it's not like a correlation with the input, but it's this person is interested in the music, or is annoyed by that person. If you can decode that concept, then an engine like this is able to get that input and provide you with the better. And of course, we have a Mamba speech separation also. All right, so where are we going with this sort of task? We are moving from the simple case that we have speaker one and speaker two, attend to this, attend to that. Now we are interested in moving conversations that happen in reverberant and noisy environments. And also there are speaker turn taking, right? So this will be, for example, your table at the restaurant, multiple people talking, and this will be the other table next to you and other people talking there. So we don't want to be, listening to a speaker one or speaker two, but it's a conversation one, conversation two. So more natural tasks for that. and so here's an example of how this works. So here is a device, basically a box that gets the sound input and the brain waves, and depending on what the person wants to do, amplifies and modifies the sound. So here, the subject was trying to focus on the male talker and then switches on to the female talker, and we turn on the system at 10 seconds.
How to be a shepherd.
Dogs
Being a
are great
shepherd can be a
companions
lot
for a
of fun,
variety of people.
especially when you know how
Have
to
you
do
ever
it.
thought about having your own
Shepherds
companion?
can be found all
If
over
you
the
do not have a
world.
dog yet,
Any
you
place
need to
from the
understand the
deserts of
difference between
Israel
breeds
to the
before
highlands
making
of
a choice.
Scotland.
The breed of a
Find a good
dog
place
can
to
have
live.
significant impact on its
Many shepherds
personality,
like to live in
as
mountains.
well as its size,
If you want
health,
to do this,
and
it would
required
be best
maintenance.
to move to Wales or
For example,
Scotland. If you
long-haired
want to
breeds,
live in the United
like
States,
collies,
move
may
to
be
Idaho
useful,
or
but they
Wyoming.
require frequent
Buy
brushing.
a sheepdog.
If you do not have time
Some
to devote to
sheepdogs are better
weekly
than
or
others.
even daily maintenance,
You would do
you may
best to
need
look on a
choose
dog
different
market
breed.
online or see
The
if you can
American
find a breeder.
Eskimo is bright.
So this would be quite useful, right?
And how do you, yeah, it's really cool. How do you decode from the ECOG? No, this is
Yes.
not. This is from ECOG.
From ECOG, yes.
Patient who is instructed to focus after 10 seconds. No, instructed to focus on one or the other.
Exactly. Exactly.
And then the DNN does the the streaming.
The DNN does a speech separation. It separates the sounds, compare each one of them to the brain, and amplifies the one that is most similar to the brain. Yeah. And I have like a minute left. I'm going to show you some wild, like in the field, in the wild examples of this. Yeah, so this helps. Where's Terry?
Which is not captured. PNN is inhibition. That somehow you're actively inhibiting certain parts according to task in a trained network. Is there something like that observed in what you see, or that question even makes sense?
I'm not sure if I completely understand, but just let me try. So the filters that I was showing, the blue parts were inhibitions, right? So those are the stimulus that the network was trying to inhibit response to those. So if that's what you mean, you can't.
Yeah, so how do you sort of replicate that in a DNN type setting, kind of?
How do you replicate it in DNN kind of setting? If a DNN that is trained to do what?
I don't know, some task.
Anything?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, presumably it learns to, like, if you're training it to, if an object doesn't exist in the scene and some signature of it exists, it has to learn not to respond to that. So to me, it seems like it should be easy to do, but maybe I'm missing.
Maybe it's not clear enough. We'll chat separately and.
I should note that inhibition is not usually in our vocabulary entirely.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Here at 10:30 for a talk by Guido on generative LLM, I think, or AI. I don't remember the exact title, but we're back here at 10:30. So, thank you, everybody. Thank you.
This is the now semi-annual talk on language models. Why does everyone care about them all of a sudden? Where does this community potentially fit in? And what does the road ahead look like? So hopefully by the end of this talk, we've done a bit of level setting around, everyone has a common understanding of what these things are doing and what everyone is hoping for them to do going forward. And then also, as I mentioned, I think that there is a lot of opportunity for the neuromorphic community to engage in specific ways. This is ballooned into a very large field. In many ways, it's heading in a direction that is playing right into the strengths of many of the folks in the room. And so I'm really excited to have these conversations over the next couple of weeks as we find opportunities for you to insert yourselves and to reshape the field as it exists today. Just one note is, I got a call this morning that our GPU server room is getting extremely warm on account of the success that we've had turning our organization into an AI native organization. If only there was a community of people who really understood how to make power efficient AI acceleration devices that we could use to solve that problem. So, let's get on that. But we're going to jump right in. So we're going to start with, as many of the first week talks do, we're going to give you a little bit of background on, well, I guess on me and why I'm here, but also kind of on how we got here as a community and what exactly is a language model and what does it have to do with brains. First question that I get asked every year is, what is MITRE? And so I just like to kind of give a really quick introduction to that, because you might notice that a handful of your colleagues here are from our organization. If you're from Europe, you might be tempted to pronounce this Mitre, but we are a US-based nonprofit, so we pronounce it MITRE. We are an organization it's a nonprofit organization that does scientific work in the public interest. So we support the federal government as a technical advisor and unbiased tester of solutions, a prototyper and evaluator. We don't make products, we don't sell anything, but we do sit on the government side of the table to make sure that they're getting the best opportunity to modernize and to adopt and drive forward the progress of the research community in a bunch of important areas. And neuromorphic engineering is absolutely a high priority area of investigation for a lot of aspects of not just the US government. I think we have, this workshop is organized by Terry from the NRRC in Canada. We've got a really diverse international crowd, and I think it's exciting that we can come together and help our various home communities kind of understand how to drive progress forward. Within that, I was already asked at the start of this, where do I sit within MITRE? So great, I've got a slide for that. And this is a slide that describes the robust IR&D program, internal and independent R&D program that we operate within MITRE. This is, so MITRE is a really unusual nonprofit. We've got about 10,000 employees. We have about $2.5 billion of annual revenue. So we're not really kind of like the kind that you drop coins in the cup on the corner. We're we're a well-resourced scientific organization that sources diverse expertise from across the scientific ecosystem. Within the room, you'll note that one of the other research directorate leaders here is Jamie Hill. But I myself lead the AI and data. And so between us, you've got a quarter of the research program leads. We cut across all 6 of MITRE's different federally funded research and development centers. We really touch almost every single federal sponsor, from Health and Human Services to the IRS to the DoD to basically you name it. We've got some way of helping influence their research investments and their adoption of artificial intelligence, which you might imagine is a very hot topic these days. All right, all the preliminaries out of the way, we're going to go back now to what is even a language model. And here's where we're going to spend a little bit of a history lesson in terms of, even if you only heard about ChatGPT, last year, it turns out that this is something that has been a scientific priority for the research community for many, many decades. Really, at its heart, the language model is just something that assigns a probability distribution over word sequences. They were originally devised as a means of scoring the realisticness or the probability of a given sequence of words. And there were a lot of reasons why you might want to do this. Once upon a time, we built speech recognition systems and machine translation systems and all of these tools for aiding people in kind of interacting with information as communicated by humans. And we did this with a really statistical driven process. It might mean that you wrote down a bunch of rules, perhaps. It might mean that you did a bunch of number crunching, but at the end of the day, you might have had a system which took some sequence of phonemes or tried to produce some sequence of phonemes from a spectrogram, perhaps, and then tried to turn that into a sequence of words. And as you can imagine, if you've ever tried building AI, it doesn't always work great the first time. And so for the longest time, this community was spending a lot of effort figuring out what does a good, for the sake of this talk, let's call it English, what does a good English sentence look like? If you come out with a sequence of words that has an extremely low probability, that might mean that you have done a really bad job of recognizing the phonemes and that you should look further down in your list of candidates and bump something up to the top. So for the longest time, people have been building statistical models that really are just scoring the plausibility of the next word that might come along, or maybe of an entire sequence of words. So you could say, no, I don't think that he said that. I think it might have been this, because this actually sounds like language. And for the longest time, that was kind of the domain of what we did with language models. It was a very vibrantly studied field, but it was kind of as a component within a larger system. By no means was it considered kind of like the holy grail of AI, but here we are today, and we're going to talk through how we got there. The thing that was observed along the way is that you could, of course, generate sequences from this probability distribution. So if I pause, you might make some guess, some probability distribution over my next word. If we just roll a dice and pick, sample from the language model, now you could make a Guido LM, sample. and whether or not it says anything meaningful is going to depend on how much context it has, whether or not it was trained on someone who had anything intelligent to say in the first place. And so I'll let you be the judge of that. The other thing that has been a mode of interaction for these things is that you can actually interact with them, right? You could let the machine sample some words, you could then add in the next word. So it was kind of the way you would steer these things. You would say, okay, given that you have, like the example here, is Madonna still alive? Yes. And then, okay, well then what's the next word given that? So you can kind of use them in this interactive mode. And that's where we ended up with ChatGPT. But let's go back a little bit further. Honestly, these things go really all the way back to the dawn of computing. You know, they were initially contrived as a means of helping with cryptanalysis during World War II. So you were trying to take something that had been encrypted and turn it into something that you could read. And of course, whether or not you had done that successfully was a really difficult thing to automate. So you had rooms full of people trying to figure this stuff out. But man, what if this new device called a computer could help us with that? So you would have these statistical models that would say, is this a likely sentence in a given language? And they weren't particularly sophisticated, but they were very useful. A lot of the math was formalized by Claude Shannon at Bell Labs, you know, kind of the father of information theory, as a lot of people think of him. And this was around his noisy channel model where, you know, the telephone companies were thinking, okay, we've got a really constrained line of communication that has some very low bandwidth. By definition, we're going to be compressing language onto this, and you're going to get out the other side some garbled representation of it. And so, you know, what's the optimal way of taking a garbled transmission and turning it into something intelligible? Well, it turns out that basically a language model is based on the math that that was designed for that. So this continued, as I mentioned, into the era of kind of speech recognition and speech compression. So if you wanted to compress speech into a smaller form, you know, knowing the likely transition matrix of this word, you know, leads to that word is really useful. And so for a long time, language modeling was used in that fashion as kind of like a model of speech compression. So you could then ask it, is this good speech? Oh yeah, like the example of the easily recognizable or misrecognizable phonemes, you know, one of the canonical error forms or examples for speech recognition in the 80s was, can you recognize speech? That's really, can you recognize speech? And you, in your brain, there is a really good top-down / meets bottom-up processing that goes on. You've got a computational framework that allows you to kind of recognize and put forward candidate hypotheses of what you think you've heard, and then to modulate that with, like, why is Guido talking about recognized speech where in Telluride there's no beach anywhere near here, but we are talking about AI, so maybe this is something about speech recognition. Ralph, what you got? Yeah, well, so Caldi is an example of a engine that was built at Hopkins. In fact, if you take a look at the 1990s here, you'll see that in this period, it was still a very statistical process. We kind of went from a time where it was rule-driven to a time when a bunch of people, and very predominantly the CLSP folks at Johns Hopkins, we're saying, hey, what if we did corpus linguistics and trained a model to recognize the statistics of the natural world in the sense of, you know, the way people really talk. And so this really dominated the field for quite a long time. And the nice thing is that you might know that there's actually a handful of kind of sister workshops to this Telluride workshop that were all kind of originated out of this 1990s techno optimism. Everyone thinks AI is dead, but we still think it's cool. So let's get together and talk about it and work on it together and show everyone that they're wrong. And so, you know, I think today it's actually called the Jelinek workshop, right? At that point in time, it was basically a Johns Hopkins summer workshop on speech recognition, and at that summer workshop, tools like Caldi originated and then gained community momentum. So it was like an early open source implementation of a lot of the cutting edge research. And so I think it's a really powerful demonstration of if a bunch of researchers get together and throw some crazy ideas at the wall, and then a handful of weeks later, you either go back to your labs and you don't have anything to do with it ever again, which we hope is not the case, or you actually build some useful things that the community can experiment with, put some weight behind and contribute to. And I really love seeing that this workshop has also started to really embody that idea of contributing out into the open source community leaving behind repositories and tools that show that we've built something interesting and that other people contribute to. And I know a lot of people here in the room have contributed to that. So of course, somewhere along the line, this becomes a really commercially viable concept, and it still is within the domain of a lot of the big tech companies that maybe didn't think of themselves as doing AI at that point in time, but are very transparently the largest AI companies in the world today. Like Google search is the process of organizing all the world's information. Back then, I distinctly remember talking to a recruiter and they were like, no, we don't do AI. I was like, you do AI. So today, they have acknowledged that they like to do AI, but back then it was like, oh no, we make like speech recognition tools. We do information retrieval, but it was just making your computer do tricks. And so a lot of these tools kind of continued to develop, but it became much more operational. They started to be actually useful for things. And, as we kind of got into this era of the 2010s, they started getting built into products. You started actually having a device on your phone that could do translation better than all these like super bespoke custom translation engines that had been developed. The speech recognition engines started to kind of move past an era where we were expecting like the statistical approaches of the 90s and 2000s to still be dominant. And it really kind of coincided with this neural revolution, perhaps unsurprisingly. And so it really became a time where everyone started thinking like, wow, what happens if we are training a neural network that doesn't contain this opportunity to do that re-ranking statistical, like what you would do is you'd build these giant matrices of candidate translations. You would score them according to language models. You would say, okay, this one's the wrong length. This one doesn't have enough of the coverage of the original one. And you come up with all these custom rules to re-rank everything and say, okay, the good translation is this. And it was like the product of linguists thinking through what's a good translation look like. How do we know one when we see one, and how do we automate that process? Then neural nets come along and we start saying, never mind, we're just going to throw away all the components. We're going to build an end-to-end system. In goes words, out comes words. Something happens in the middle. Where do you put the language model? There's nowhere to put it, right? We don't really know. So it started becoming obvious that the language model was inside of the neural net, that it had to develop a language model in order to successfully decode a good translation, a good speech recognition. And around that time is when people started really kind of aggressively pursuing the neuro language models as a means of, kind of like seeing how much information was kind of contained in this thing and how much could you cram in there and how useful could it be. And at this point, this is still all just word prediction. This is still all just kind of like scoring the probabilities of sequences. But it turns out that it was just a really useful thing to be doing. And so that's kind of why we were doing this. And at that point, the community got behind it. And well, we're about to talk how we got here, but this is kind of the groundwork for how we accidentally stumbled across this idea of, ChatGPT, for example. So yeah, we're gonna step it back. We're gonna keep it nice and simple. I think one of the most famous quotes in all of computational linguistics is by a linguist by the name of J.R. Firth. Came in his book in 1957, and is a really succinct description of everything that came to follow, which is, you shall know a word by the company it keeps. It really just means that there is a lot of information contained within about a word, within an investigation of the words that surround it, that show up at the same time as it, that precede it, that follow it, that are, you can, from this, you can infer lots of things. And so with this example, if I say I went to the blank to check out a book, you don't even need to know what the blank word is. I think you could all take a guess, but from this context, you're going to be able to figure out that the blank word is a place that you can go to, a place that has books in it, presumably, a place that you interact with through, this mode of checking out a book. You don't even need to know what that means, but it kind of gives you some affordance of whatever that word is. It has some ways that it interacts with other words that it can be observed just directly by building up these lists of co-occurrences, we would call them. And so for the longest time, language models were basically built on this premise of let's just count all the words. Let's get all of the words that people have written down and let's start counting. And so this is actually something that we did back at the 2015 Telluride workshop, where I was kind of pointing out that really a co-occurrence matrix is all you need to understand words. And the thing that I think is kind of interesting, actually, let me explain the right-hand side of this first. So So this is the Ngram model that was developed at IBM in the 80s and kind of like formed the basis for all of the different tools that we just talked about. There, a lot of advances in it over the the years that followed. But essentially what you're doing is you're picking some Ngram, which is a number of words in a row. A 3-gram would be three consecutive words. And you start counting, how many times does this sequence of 3 words show up in my corpus? Out of all of the 3-word sequences that have been observed, you get some really tiny number, right? And it's also a really sparse thing because it turns out language is more or less infinite, and your ability to count words that were on the internet at that time was not. But what you ended up with was just kind of a bunch of lists. So if you have these 3 words, what is the X% of the time, the next word that follows is this. Okay, you've got a 0.00017 probability of this transition. Cool. Now let's get really good at doing math that doesn't underflow with these kind of, basically you're just working with the log probabilities of these sequences of words. And so you're just counting co-occurrences. Now, the thing that I think is very often overlooked insight to draw from this is the fact that it really is just kind of a large scale coincidence detection of the form that we are very fond of describing the brain. When we think like, what is Hebbian learning? The wire together, fire together kind of a thing, or fire together, wire together kind of thing. And so really, it's something that doesn't require like a super sophisticated set of learning primitives in order to build up this co-occurrence matrix. You can say, just sit here and let the world wash over you, and these populations of neurons can light up that represent individual tokens. They don't have to begin with any sort of meaning, but as they start to kind of, at some crossbar develops synapses that say, oh yeah, these words show up all the time. It is basically developing a probability transition matrix that is a compressed representation of this super sparse co-occurrence matrix. And so it's something that is very easy to implement in spikes. It's something that we implemented in spikes back in 2015, shoved onto a True North chip and showed that, you could feed it the cat in the hat and it would be like, oh yeah, those words one fish, 2 fish, right? And it would be like, oh yeah, those words 1 and 2 seem to be really similar. Let's put them near each other in this vector space because the co-occurrences for each of them have very similar cosine similarity. They the same angle in high dimensional space. The only bummer about this is that, well, there's a couple. One is that it is, as I mentioned, extremely sparse. So the ability to do language modeling oftentimes hinged on your ability to do intelligent smoothing. So you would have to back off. You'd say, well, I've never seen these 4 words in a row before, so I don't have any idea what the 5th one is. But wait, okay, what if we start looking at some of the 3-gram, the trigram transition probabilities, and can we make some reasonable guesses? If we assume that the probability isn't 0, then what is it? And so there were just a lot of mental energy went into figuring out how you smooth across, an infinite probability space when you just are really counting things. And the other thing is that it's really inconvenient to carry these things around, right? Like imagine if every time I said a word, you had to consult your lookup table of how many times it had been seen near every word, compare that to every other word you ever seen, and build a new map of what this, what the representation implied. And so it kind of points you in the obvious direction of like, maybe this is compressible. Maybe this is like a neural network just waiting to be made. Maybe this is something where we could kind of put a bottleneck in place and end up with like a dense representation that encodes all the information of a much higher representational sparse co-occurrence matrix. And that is basically word vectors. That is the thing that allowed us to say, we can take a giant corpus of language and we can automatically train up a nice compact set of representations that are super useful for machines to operate over. And that was kind of where we found ourselves. Well, we started wanting to do things like, to operate on individual words, to say, is this a word like, does this emoji map to this meaning? Does this word carry some emotional valence that's easy to interpret? All these types of things. We were like in 2015, I was building hate speech detection algorithms. So you build word embeddings based off of all of the Twitter online, and you would find the many different ways that idiots on the internet misspell hate speech because, you find out that they aren't the most intelligent people and the machine is able to kind of discern from context, like, yeah, here's all the ways that people say something mean to each other. And so it's a really good insult generator as well. Maybe not the basis for, the most defining AI technology of the 2020s, we didn't think, but I guess, again, here we are. So let's get towards that. One other thing that is a little bit fun, oftentimes no one really believes me. I say like, oh yeah, I've been working in 2001. And they're like, what? Did we even have AI in 2001? I'm like, I don't even know how to answer that question. Yeah, we've been working on this problem. Like literally, it was like the first thing that Alan Turing was like, okay, I made a computer. Oh crap, how do I know if it's smarter than me, right? And so we've been working on this forever. It's really hard to kind of demonstrate this, but I was actually looking through the 2015 Telluride outbrief slides that I made, and I came here talking about like, oh yeah, you can do character language models. And you can build a neural network that compresses all of this information. And then the fun thing is you can turn it into like a weird little, spewer. So you start sampling from it. And even back then, it was like really easy to just kind of get something that you started it out with a little bit of Shakespearean vibes, and it would just kind of start turning it into a play that makes absolutely no sense. You would start it with some latex code, and it would generate mostly valid code, extremely invalid proofs, right? Like if you look at this, it makes absolutely no sense. And so this was at a point in time, if I should kind of show you the model, we were using LSTMs, we were using traditional recurrent neural networks, we're using all sorts of kind of alternatives to these things, but they had such a fixed ability to remember anything in time that by the time you got to like the 100th character, you had forgotten a lot of the stuff that so it was really impressive that, you could even get it to remember the names of the characters that it already said, because for the most part, this was a really hard thing to do back then. So the vanishing gradients were the bane of recurrent neural network approaches. And the ability to kind of add gates, the GRU, the LSTM kind of started to change everyone's perspective. But the elephant in the room is, that's still only getting you like a tiny window back. And so everyone is kind of thinking, how are we going to make this much more capable at long context types of tasks? The good news is along comes the transformer. And the transformer is unquestionably the tool that made the modern language modeling ecosystem work. The thing that is kind of difficult to explain about it is that doesn't mean that it's the right tool. It means that it is the best tool for parallelizing huge computations across many different computers and showing huge amounts of information to them. But the other thing that it does is it really opened up this ability to kind of attend to things that were a lot further back in your time window. And so I'm gonna try and take a really quick spin through what we're looking at here. This is a graphic of a single layer of a transformer block that was produced by MS Struble back in 2018. And I think it's still a nice, easy way to kind of like demonstrate of what a transformer block is doing. So we're going to start with this idea of you've got a token, right? And a token in this case is a word, which, at that point in time, we hadn't kind of moved into the subwords as effectively as we have today. So it was a word. Well, you would have to turn it into one. So what happens is you take a word, you have a one-hot embedding, lookup that says, okay, let's create an embedding of the word. But as I mentioned, when you're just working with individual words, they have many meanings. They are varied. They depend heavily on the context in which they live, right? And so you can pack as much of that into the word embedding as you can feasibly. But at some level, you just want to know, oh, should I be the version of the word bank that means the money bank, or should I be the version of the word bank that means the river bank, or should I be the version of the word that's a verb that means I'm banking something? And so the easiest way to do that is to provide context around it. Ralph? So in practice, you really want a constrained vocabulary just to make it a tractable computation. And a lot of energy has gone into deciding what is the right tokenization scheme that gets you to the optimal. There is really no optimal. Kavya, in many instances, it's something like 256 units, but it could be, some power of 2 usually. Oh, no. So it's a lookup table. So, right. So the word optics has a embedding that gets learned in the course of doing this computation. But let me walk through this. But first, I'll just mention that it's really important to note that the tokenization schemes are kind of an unsolved problem. it turns out that we used to do words as tokens, and then you would say, okay, I only have enough room for 20,000 tokens, because you also need, it's your output as well, as you need to be able to pick from one of the 20,000. And so anything that wasn't one of your 20,000 most frequent tokens gets replaced with an unknown word vector. It turns out that's really annoying. Humans don't like seeing sentences that have unk in them. And so we kind of moved in a direction where people started saying, okay, well, what are the minimal units inside of words that are frequent, and how would we create like a full coverage set of tokens that lets you never not know what a token is? The problem is that if you take an English bias to this, you're producing tokens that are extremely poorly adapted for other language, other scripts. And a lot of the community has been kind of like driven around by this. And I encourage people to talk to Kavya about this problem. It's something that she studied in depth and is like there in spades in a lot of the modern machine learning systems. You can kind of imagine like, even like the easiest example would be if English word, you know, becomes one token, but a Japanese character gets turned into like 6 different byte, you know, level tokens because you need to string them together so you don't get an unk. Now you've just used up 6 of these context slots just producing one word, and so it means you can fit in a lot less information into your algorithm, and so it has to work a lot harder and do a lot more computation just to read a language that's not written in a script like ours. So it's a very open problem. But let's walk through this, okay? So your notional pathway here is you start with a word and you project that into some dense embedding space. Now the embedding space then gets reprojected into 3 different vectors. You have a key vector, a query vector, and a value vector. And really what's happening, the attention process, is you're asking each word, you know, in this case, we're looking at optics, don't get hung up on the specifics, but optics is gonna look at every single other word and it's gonna do a dot product. It's gonna say, okay, well, I have a query vector. I'm asking what kind of optics am I? And I wanna know who's got a key vector that is a good fit, you know, which word in this list of keys kind of like maximizes the dot product with my query vector. And so now you're getting kind of like a distribution of attention. It's saying, okay, and maybe in this case, and this doesn't make sense, but, you know, like maybe it's like 20%, you know, advanced, maybe it's like 30% Nobel, and you're kind of building up this weighted attention vector. And it's just a linear sum at this point. So now what you're going to do is you're going to say, okay, well, I'm attending 20% to this. I'm going to take 20% of the value vector from this. I'm going to add to 30% of the value vector from this. And that's my new representation. That's this representation right here. Okay. Well, so it turns out that there's lots of different ways to want to attend to a sequence. You might want to know how deep into the sequence are you. You might want to know what part of speech am I? You might want to know, you know, there's a lot of, this is all trainable. And so what people end up doing is they train many different attention heads. So for any given token at any given layer, it's attending to every single other token in the context with many different kinds of attention. And then you're stacking those resulting recontextualized vectors, and then you're combining them into your final representation. And yeah, that's an appropriate way to think of it. And the thing that is kind of interesting is that you end up with an output that is of this exact same dimensionality as the input. And so you can stack this on top of itself infinitely, and basically kind of, you can even make it like a, you know, like a rectified, basically you're making it as a like skip connection. So you're saying, okay, tweak these embeddings by a little bit based off of what you see in your context. Now let's do that 64 times, okay? So you're stacking these things, and at the end, what you end up with is at each position, you've got a representation of a token that is loosely informed by where it started, but really by this process of repeatedly attending to everything in its context and deciding, oh, I'm one of these. Oh, I should be more like this. Okay, it would be more useful for the prediction if I attended to this word. So I'm going to do more of that. And yep. Yeah, sure. Not the biological attention. So I mean, yeah, the thing that is kind of insane is that in biology, attention is a process of winnowing down the amount of computation you need to do. This is the polar opposite. You know, the thing that is, it's making a more valuable output because it is saying, okay, I have now pulled all of the other information that's available to me repeatedly, and I have combined it in ways that are driven by the task that I'm doing, but it's a very computationally intensive process. And the thing that the purple vectors are just kind of, these are the attention weightings. So this, for any one of these channels, this is saying, okay, I'm mostly attending to optics. This one is kind of like smearing it across all the different words. And, each one of these gets used to create one of those. But the thing that is probably obvious to you and is something that we've been talking a little bit as something that this community needs to expend energy helping solve is this relationship between the amount of computation you need to do and the length of your sequence, right? Because the polynomial scaling of your attention process drives all of the computation that happens in a transformer network for the most part. It's really extremely computationally intensive. So whereas in your brain, attention tends to be like, I'm actually ignoring all these things. I'm turning off this processing channel because it's not relevant to me right now. And, let me know when I should turn it back on kind of a thing. This is more like we're doing everything all the time. And that way we don't miss anything important. And out the other end comes a really good word prediction. So self-attention is this process of updating your own self-representation by looking at everything around you. So the nice thing about this is that you could do this on different GPUs. You say, GPU 1, you're doing the word optics. GPU 2, you're doing the word, and obviously there's communication that needs to go back, but some of the computation is just, it's embarrassingly parallelizable. And so that's the self-attention mechanism. The multi-head is the fact that we have many of these. And so it's just a way of saying there's no single attention mask that is the right one for every task. You're going to need to learn many, and they themselves will get recombined in ways that are driven by the task you're doing. And so what you end up with is an incredibly sparse computation, because this is throwing away information in a sense, right? Like when you're doing a weighted average of all of your inputs, you're saying, okay, I'm losing information in this, but you're getting a single more well-compressed useful vector. So it is kind of, that's why it's the word attention gets used there. But it is, it's like a little computer inside your computer. Literally the way it was described to me first by one of the guys who helped invent it is like, you put a neural net inside your neural net that helps your neural net know which parts of the neural net should be active. And you're like, okay, that sounds like it's neural nets all the way down. Fast forward to 2024, it's absolutely neural nets all the way down. So he was right. This was a really good intuition, but it's computationally expensive. Yep. Great question. So for the folks online, it was if you run a prompt over and over, why do you kind of get like variable outcomes? And also there's a sub question I'm going to add in there, which is like, wait, every time we want to generate a word, do we have to run this whole network? Answer to the second one is yes. So think of how expensive that is. But in the formalism that I introduced, where we're producing a probability distribution over words, we're still on the output side producing, like, okay, I think the next word is 17% library, 12%, bookstore, and we're sampling. And so there's still that random process. Now you can fix your random seed. You can get a process that, runs many different beam searches and picks the best one according to some metric. So you can make it deterministic. It's not probabilistic in the sense of it can't be deterministic, but it is useful to be able to sample from these things repeatedly, because if you don't like the answer you get the first time, try again, right? And so there's a lot of value in that in some instances. Yep, you got it. Exactly, yeah. Everything else is, all the other non-determinism comes down to like rounding errors with floating point operations, because if you have 170 billion floats, there's a lot of opportunity for rounding errors to add up. So if you run a training process over and over, you won't get the same network out the other end. But if you take a model that is fixed and you sample from it with a deterministic sampling pattern, you will get a deterministic sequence sampled from it. It's just not the most useful way to do that most of the time. Yeah? Well, so that's a great example of the type of thing that self-attention is really good at overcoming, because you can imagine that if you've got a typo, the worst thing in the world is you give it a separate vector and you say these aren't the same word, and so I need to learn everything about it separately. So what you might end up with here is a word that then realizes through the, I mean, I'm personifying here in a way that is inappropriate, but the self-attention process allows the context of the word to make clear through computation that the meaning of this typoed word is basically the same. It fills the exact same function that you would expect out of the correctly spelled word, except maybe it carries a little bit of signal, which is the person who typed this in doesn't know how to spell very well. And so maybe that actually changes the output. Maybe you're supposed to produce informal text, you know? So there are all sorts of ways that you don't want to throw away that information, but it is capable of recovering from it through the self-attention process. And so we're already talking a lot about what is a token. It's really useful to kind of point out that it can vary dramatically by task, and that this is, you know, that basically everything seems to work better when you figure out how to tokenize it and feed it to a self-attention, you know, a transformer architecture. So a lot of energy has gone into this, and it has changed the way people do vision. It's changed the way people do all sorts of different things. So if you look at each color here is a different token. The thing that you'll notice is exactly what I described earlier, which is that for things that would have been rare words, like, you know, GPT-4 wasn't in your training data, maybe, because you were making GPT-4 and it hadn't made it onto the internet. And so in the old days, that would have been an unk, because that would have been like one word. We would have said, oh, I've never seen that before. It's not frequent enough to know what it is. So what it would do here is it would back off and say, like, well, I know what a G is. I know what a capital G is. Oh, I know what capital, in this case, PT is, and a dash and a 4. And so it composes 4 consecutive tokens into this input sequence that we just described on the previous slide. So it uses up more computation, but it lets you say, oh, we're never going to get to a place where there's a word I don't know. So when you say, oh, you can only put n number of tokens into GPT or whatever, that is not a word count. It is, you know, the number of words is kind of like the bound for the number of tokens, but for the most part, it's going to be some like multiple, like 2.3, something like that. I think on average, you're looking at like a tokenization scheme will expand that on the number of words by some low multiple. This is something that might resonate. Oh yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So I mean, yeah, what you're describing is kind of the surface form of a word, and it's definitely worth noting that it doesn't know what the surface form is. It has to learn it from context, right? And so the examples where people will say, you know, count the I's in here, or you know, delete the third to the last letter. Well, somewhere in there, to do that successfully, it's going to need to know that this PT token has 2 letters in it. At no point do you tell it that. So it's going to need to figure that out from training on massive amounts of data. So it's possible to do these tasks if like you're really desperate for your GPT to do these tasks. And they have, in fact, put a lot of energy into it because it makes them look really stupid when it doesn't know how to spell the word lollipop. But I mean, you know, think of the amount of coal that's been burned in service of helping GPT count the L's in lollipop, and it's kind of upsetting. But anyway, you know, that's where we are. Yep. They can be very different, you know, because they can be informed by your desire to make a multilingual language model. If you look, I mean, if you look at some of the tokenization scheme for GPT-4o, it's horrifying. It's clearly trained on a lot of like Chinese porn internet. And so there's like terms in there where you're like, why is that one of your top tokens, you know? But so there is no single best token. There is definitely a lot of active research into what are good, like what's an equitable tokenization scheme, what is the most useful for different contexts. And yeah, we could do a whole hour-long session on, I'm probably about to, on tokenization schemes alone. But yeah, again, Kavya here is someone who's really studied the impact of like the cultural impact of low resource languages not being reflected in tokenization schemes. So there's an argument that it needs to change. I mean, you could, if you are making an explicit choice to do so, but for the most part, I've not seen that information explicitly represented. You're expecting the models to learn this from huge amounts of training data and huge iterations through it. So it's, yeah. Absolutely, yep. And for tonal languages, the meaning of the word, right? Yeah, exactly. So I mean, there are a lot of nuances to all of this, and you know, this slide only scratches the surface. For the most part, anyone in this room is probably just going to grab a tokenizer off the shelf and let it rip. But you're going to find that there is a lot of ample research opportunity in that space too. So when we look at things like how do you tokenize an image, you know, there's a lot of energy went into figuring this out. I think anyone who kind of worked in dictionary learning and the, you know, compression of images is going to be really happy to find out that that is basically exactly how you tokenize an image. You say you run maybe an autoencoder and you're clustering image patches into things where you're like, okay, that pretty much looks like patch number 17,012, and maybe it's something that has a dog's eye in it or whatever, but you don't know that information a priori. It's just kind of like, if you're looking to compress this, you know, with an efficient coding scheme, then that's your tokenization. For things like audio, you're going to oftentimes start with a spectrogram, you know, so it's also an image process, but then that's something that contains different types of positional information in it. So you might, you know, be looking at like a vertical slice as opposed to, you know, just like kind of a patch which loses the frequency information. The other thing that's worth noting is that all of these things carry different forms of spatial information, and it's really important to encode that effectively. So a lot of work on positional encodings has been done. I left that out from the previous here, but really what you should think is that next to each one of these is another little vector that's like, hey, I'm the 17th word. Hey, I'm the 18th word. And there are relative versions of this. There are multiple, you know, 2D versions of this. There are lots of different ways that you tell the network you're looking at a token that is near or far from this other token, so that when it's attending, it has an idea of some proximity, because that matters to many applications, unsurprisingly. And I threw this one in here because, you know, kind of point cloudy types of stuff can also be tokenized in, you know, voxels. And so that's basically what you're doing is you're, again, learning some discrete code. If we're going to get to a point where we get really serious about event-based transformers, then I think we're going to need to think really hard on what is a good tokenization scheme. A bunch of stuff's been proposed, pretty efficient. You need a huge data set in order to know what a good dictionary of event volumes looks like, but that might be something that's important to this community going forward. All right, and now we're going to sprint through the, we've kind of done the background of like, how do you build a language model and what are these things constructed out of, and maybe what biases are going to emerge from them. We still haven't talked at all about how to make them useful, right? Like, you know, the thing is that for the longest time, GPT whatever was just another thing that just kind of like sampled the next word, and it turns out for the most part, you don't need that. You know, you needed it for your speech recognition toolkit, for example, but you didn't need it for much else. And so you would do things like test it with some autoregressive task, like write a story that combines Cinderella and running marathons. You know that this works well today, but this is what you would have gotten out of GPT-3, right? Oh, here's how to get it published. Here's a fun, simple way to put together a story that's true to Cinderella's story and can be printed as an ebook. Is advertising copy, right? Is some idiot on the internet who's trying to sell you some, you know, guide to self-publishing your Cinderella story. The reason that's an autocomplete is because GPT-3 was trained on the internet. There's a lot of ads on the internet. It read them all and it will spew it right back out. Awesome. Who needs that? Like, I didn't need more of the internet that was just written by a machine. And I think it's still debatable that we need that now. But that's what you would get out of GPT-3. So, okay, that doesn't really make sense. How are we going to make it useful? Well, what people were doing for a while is you like the original version of prompt engineering was this trick where you're like, what is the beginning of a sentence that's going to make GPT-3 say something fun? So you might say, once upon a time, there was a girl named Cinderella and she loved running marathons. And it could be like, oh, I see, we're telling a story. Okay, one day she was beginning to understand that she really had a special place in the hearts of people she met, had a wonderful husband and son. They ran every morning when they could. one day Cinderella ran a marathon. It happened. She ran alongside the man who would become her husband. And you're like, wait, you just told me she's married. This is the weirdest version of the Cinderella story I ever heard. So, okay, so while you could get it to do a task, is this more useful than the other thing? Debatable. And so that's why for the longest time, these things were sitting on the shelf and were just kind of party tricks more than the foundational technology to rule the world. So what happened? Well, we got to this idea of instruction fine-tuning, this idea that we should give it a prefix in it to its prompt that gives it an idea of what task it's doing, so that you don't need to demonstrate the task in context. You say, you are writing a story, write me a story. Here's what I want from you. And the interesting thing is that you can create these instruction tuning tasks where you've already taught it to do next word. Yeah, but yes, exactly. I was just about to do that. Thank you. So when you do your pre-training, the GPT-3, this is the autoregressive text completion. That is still the base layer of everything we're talking about. For anything that had GPT-3 in the name, it was still that same ad copy, drivel producing, internet thing. But then we say, okay, what if we keep training it with some additional context now that it at least understands sequences of words well enough to be able to kind of string together the meaning out of a sequence of instructions that I give it. Let's see how far we can push it. And so people started taking every data set that they could find on the internet that had been created for machine learning with traditional NLP and turning it into something that became an instruction. So in this case, it would be, you don't just say, what is the boiling point of nitrogen? Because autocomplete would be, that's a really good question. And you're like, well, I wanted you to answer it. So instead you say, construct a data set where you append, please answer the following question. What's the boiling point of nitrogen? And then you give it the answer in the form that you want, which you already had lying around because you had a Jeopardy data set, right? And so you're just saying, here's what it means to answer a question. Here's what it means to reason step by step, like the math problem types of things. Here's what it means to, dance for me in 1,000 different ways. And 1,000 turns out to be underselling it. Some researchers, I think this particular one came out of Google, where it was, you go around to every data set you can find, every task you can find, you turn it into one mega data set that's composed of several thousand different tasks types. And then reforming all the data that's already existed into something that shows what it means to follow instructions. And so in our metaphor here, every Aesop's fable gets turned into data for GPT, where you say, write me a story about fable topic 1, fable topic 2, and then you give it the actual fable, right? Or write me a fable with the title, the fox and the whatever, and then you give it and so it's a way of demonstrating this is what the task of writing a story for me looks like. And this is something that is very important to the field today, like figuring out how to take things that we know, that we care about, that the machine might not have seen before, and turning it into instructions. And so here's something I was messing around with. You take the abstract out of a survey paper on event-based vision sensors, and you actually can ask an LLM to do this for you. You say, okay, take this paragraph, break it up into things where some insight might be contained, turn it into a question answer pair of the form that looks like this. And it'll say, who started working on the stereo problem from a biological and engineering perspective in 1986? Mishima Howell, graduate student at Caltech, started working on the stereo problem with Professor Carver Mead, which is contained up here. And so it's just a reformatting of information that has been found into something that then is an instruction tuning. Now, this might not be the best example, but it's a way that you would want to get creative around thinking, how do I show it how to do a thing that I care about, and how can I turn data that I have lying around into that? So how does that work for Cinderella? Well, it turns out you can get these things to start doing stuff. So this is GPT 3.5, also known as the precursor to ChatGPT. A quick story, if you look at the lore of ChatGPT, this was like 9 months after GPT 3.5, their first instruction tuned GPT came out. GPT 3.5 had like no users, no one cared. They pushed out ChatGPT like on a Friday, I think. It was something where they were like, we'll see if anyone wants to try this one, it seems better. And then the whole internet burned down, and they're like, whoa, wait a second, people like this. They were caught off guard. because again, we've been talking about this paradigm. Those instruction tuning data sets have been out for over a year at this point. You know, like there was a lot of, it was just the latest example and the one that was most accessible to anyone interacting with it, but it's just the latest in a line of research experimentation that had been going on for a very long time. So, okay, how does it do with Cinderella? Well, GPT 3.5 gets a little bit better. It says, once upon a time, there was one named Cinderella, had a passion for running every day. She would lace up her running shoes. She dreamt to run a marathon, but she knew it was hard. So she set on her journey. She trained every day. She woke up early, ran for miles, built up her endurance and strength. You're like, okay, wait, you're telling me a story, but like, that's a crap story, right? Like, no one wants to hear about Cinderella worked super hard and with determination and grit, you know, ran a marathon. Like, we want the Cinderella part to be respected too. So it kind of makes you realize like instruction tuning in and of itself isn't enough to get you a good answer, especially in these creative modes, right? It's not like it'll do the task, but a lot of the tasks are creative. They're infinite. There's a million trillion Cinderella marathon stories that you could tell, and some of them are good and some of them are bad. So maybe we need a process by which we feed that information into the machine and see if it can get even better. Hence, the latest stage of you know, kind of driving these models forward has really worked on alignment to human values, which could mean what's a good story look like? It could mean what is a rude story? What is a toxic story? What is a dangerous story? You know, there's a lot of different dimensions along which you might have a robot that you don't want doing things. And so this is a process for capturing kind of like these ambiguous preferences that people have and turning it into a demonstration of the machine. So, you know, the easiest example there would be sample 2 different stories. Which one do people like better? Okay, reward that, disregard the worst one, and eventually slowly over time nudge it towards things that people rate highly. Turns out there's a lot of ways you could think about this. You know, I don't know if anyone remembers, but there was a dude at Google who got fired for basically almost kind of falling in love with one of their chatbots, right? And you know, kind of precursor to where we are today. But it was really interesting because that was just an LM that had been tuned for a bunch of different dimensions that were, you know, make sure that first of all, you're saying things that are sensible. So like intelligible, something that is specific, not just like, oh, I don't know, but like, while a correct answer could also be more helpful. You know, interesting to people, safe, you know, so it doesn't violate like some safety principle, grounded in real world facts, so not making up facts, helpful in the sense of like doing the thing that the person asked you to do, and then role consistency. So you shouldn't say like that you're 3 different things, you know, so you should understand that you're behaving as an agent. And so training a model along those lines got us to a robot that some dude was like, it's sentient. It told me it's sentient. We should not unplug it, you know? And so it's enough to really fool anyone. It's we talked a lot last year about how it's kind of this mirror, like you see in it what you want to see. But this process is what makes it feel a lot more human, because it produces things that are pleasing to humans and therefore are more likely to be interpreted by humans as an intelligent behavior. But it's still a mechanical process. Yep. We're going to get to that also, don't worry. I mean, yes, question mark, is I think my short answer of whether AI is AI fear-mongering bullshit. But we'll get there. There are ways that, you know, there are responsible ways to develop this technology that are respectful of diverse opinions there. So what does that get you with the era of ChatGPT? A really awesome story, right? You know, you basically get something about how Cinderella was training for a marathon, but the wicked stepsisters took away her running shoes, I think. So something along the lines of she was resourceful. She fashioned a pair of running shoes out of stuff that she had available. She was running the race. Halfway through, they turned back into the crap that she'd made them out of. She runs the race barefoot because she's, you know, she's just awesome. And then at the end, she crosses the finish line to everyone's surprise. In first place, the prince, who is the sponsor of the marathon, was so impressed by her determination that he asked her to marry him, and they all lived happily ever after. Exactly. And it turns out that's what people want. And so we tuned it to, you know, right? Like, yeah, there's a lot of bad stories out there and people like this story. And so it's just kind of a good example. There's And like these things have been extensively tuned for storytelling because it is economically viable, right? Everyone wants to charge $12.99 for an Alexa that can tell your kid a bedtime story, that doesn't say start swearing at your kid, it doesn't, you know, right? And so there's a lot of energy kind of that's gone into exactly this process of refining what's a good, safe, happy Alexa branded type of story. Okay, we're not done because that's just ChatGPT. And since then, you know, everyone in the world decided to make their own model and figure out, you know, what they could do with it. And so this is just kind of a retelling of what we've just described so far, but it also, you know, like we can also ask AI to build us pictures of Cinderella running marathons, and she looks super happy. Her running shoes got cropped out because like it was some weird kind of deformed looking thing, and it kind of takes away from my story a little bit. But yeah, I think we've seen that we've come a long way. But what next? So the first thing that I just want to make sure we emphasize is that the worst use case for an LLM, the thing that seems to be like 80% of the evaluation metrics that everyone uses, and the thing that I find the least interesting and least compelling mode of interaction with an LLM, is this idea of you take your computer, you put it up on top of the mountain, and then you say, oh, great computer, will you tell me the boiling point of nitrogen? And it is like, yes, human, it's 7. And you're like, okay, cool. And you're like, is that right? I don't know, right? But this idea of just kind of asking it questions that you could find out yourself, not very compelling to me, because the hallucination aspect is not going to be fixed. It's built into the system. It's telling you stories that you want to hear. And so a good story is not always a true story. Ralph, you had a question? One, yeah. I mean, so I'm not saying that no one should be doing this. I'm saying I don't think it's the cool thing to do. I'm saying that I don't think the research that I invest in is not that. I think that Google is going to have billions of dollars invested in that. I think all of the people who want to be Google are going to have billions of dollars invested in that. I don't recommend that as the research direction for a bunch of PhDs who want to contribute to the moving forward the field, because I think there's so much energy in that space that it is really going to be difficult for you to kind of come up with something that changes the fundamental, you know, path forward. And I just love to caution people that this is not the cool thing to work on anyway, in my opinion. There's a bunch of cool stuff. Yeah. Well, so I guess what I would say is that Copilot kind of implies this human interaction mode that can be creative. So we might start with a story where I say, write me a story of Cinderella running a marathon. It gives me a mediocre one. I say, you know, this would be better with sharks. Put some sharks in there. And, you know, so it's kind of like this co-creation concept that is way more compelling. But again, that's a creation. That's a creative mode. That's a giving you inspiration. It's giving you pointers. It's breaking you outside of your thought patterns. You know, I personally don't recommend anyone try and solve Google's put glue on pizza problem for them. I think that they're going to solve it for themselves, right? And in their case, that just means get Reddit out of your data set, because some 14-year-old teenager in 2012 was literally the one who said put glue on pizza, and like here we are in the era of you know, the most valuable search engine in the world is happy to regurgitate that with a reference saying like, look, I did a good job of sourcing my reference material. And you're like, oh, okay. So that's all just to be said. Like you shouldn't trust these in the sense of they're an oracle. You should use them recognizing that they've been trained for creativity. And oftentimes that means plausibility over correctness. They are being worked towards correctness. And there's a lot of things that you can build around them to make them more correct. It's not a wrong thing to ask them questions, but it's just not the research frontier necessarily, because hallucinations are part of what you're building an LLM for. So this is where you start getting into the structure that you build around these. So retrieval augmented was actually literally the thing that caused the glue on pizza result. Unfortunately, if you take a bunch of Reddit and you put it in the context, and I'm going to flip forward real quick. This is retrieval augmented generation. It's a very simple thing. Instead of you having to provide your whole prompt with all the information, it's going to go out and find information to shove into the context for you, right? So that could be a web search. It could be some database that you've already set up. So if you look at this flow, person asks a query, the query gets turned into an embedding. So we make it a dense vector, like that query vector that we talked about in the attention process. It's something like that. you go to your pre-processed database of all your memories, your episodic memories, we would call them in this room, and say, which one of them, give me the top 10 ones that are most similar to this query. And maybe that's, 10 different tax filings for some company that I'm asking something about. What this hinges on is having a really good embedding and a really good retrieval. And one area that we've been talking about working at this workshop is, when you're composing documents down into an embedding, you're losing a lot of information, you're throwing away a lot of information. And I suspect that biology has a lot to say about what it means to work with memory, to make it adaptive, to make it updated in an online fashion, to kind of make it retrieve things in a way that is using kind of a much more distributed processing. So I think there's something there for us. But really what it's doing is you're just using that to build a list of things that you're going to shove into the text of the prompt. So, I say, tell me about the Telluride Neuromorphic Engineering Workshop. It turns out that Gemma already knows all about us. So it was a really bad demonstration. I was like, hey, cool, we made the AI's brain, but it wasn't the example I was looking for. But the retrieval augmented version of that would be, okay, I'm going to go do a web search for Telluride Neuromorphic Engineering Workshop. I'm going to take the top 10 hits. I'm going to extract the text from them, and I'm going to shove it into the body of the query. And then I'm going to do the generation step. And you won't get shown that, but the machine will be reading the internet as it's answering your question. And so in theory, this is much more grounded, right? Like instead of having to have stored within the weights of the network an understanding of what is Telluride, it is able to grab a web page and say, I know how to read it, and let me read back to you what I saw. Well, you can kind of think of, in this instance that I'm describing, it's a web search that is acting as that vector database. So you could take a crawl of the internet, chunk it up into pieces, vectorize it, and do a traditional RAG. You could also do a tool using RAG, which is really what I just described unfairly to the audience. Well, so in the vector database, it's going to be whatever you think you're going to need to shove in. So you could put in some really compelling examples or things like task demonstrations. So we've noticed that that LLMs are really good at learning in context. So you say, do this for me. Here's 3 examples of what I mean by doing this. And then now do it. And it can do some ability to kind of like look at the examples and say, oh, you want this output format. You want me to be factually grounded, to do chain of thought, whatever. So there's some really interesting work on like, what does it mean to compress task instructions into a form that doesn't make it specific to the instance? So it's like, how would you generalize across all tasks to say, here's a template for the task that you're going to be asked to do. And then you can pull that and put it into the context. And so it's a very rapid changing field. You can kind of think of this as anything that you're going to want to shove into the text window when you're asking a question of the LLM, that is something that could be vectorized for this database. The other thing that you can do, which is referred to on this slide, is start thinking about tool using. And so rather than using a vector as the means of storing and retrieving, you could say, why are you asking me to do math with an LLM? LLMs aren't supposed to be doing math. We're supposed to be making up stories about Cinderella. I'm going to give you a fable about how to do math. But wait, someone invented calculators. Why don't I use a calculator? So what you might do in that instance is train GPT to output a sequence of buttons you're going to hit on the calculator, hit the equal sign, take the output of that and shoving it back into the context window. There's a long list of things that people have thought of as tools in this instance, and it's more or less infinite. Anything you can think of could be a tool. Doesn't mean it's a good idea, but there are lots of things that people are trying. So it could be like an example for robot planning is there's optimal trajectories that could be calculated. So if I say, pick a path for me to the corner of the room, here's the layout of the room, you can turn that into a formal reasoning problem, hand that over to a formal solver, which then hands back an answer, which then you translate into words and say, walk around the chairs and go to the whatever. So you have a question? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that is kind of a bit of a different talk because that's relying on a diffusion process, which is you can do image generation as a sequence of tokens, image tokens, and people do, but it is not efficient. Like start in the upper left and start reading words to me that describe which image patch I should paste in. So yeah, longer conversation there. We'll start with Johannes. And just to like bring it back around to your proposed suggestion, like if you go to OpenAI and say, draw me a chart that shows the adoption of GPUs in AI year over year, showing an upward trend, it will gather some data that fulfills the story, which maybe not be truthful, but it will gather that data. It will write using a tool, a chunk of code that will like matplotlib you a graph that actually positions the text. It will draw the bars with accurate numbers. It'll basically just show you a little spinning circle while it's writing code to itself, double checking its code, running it through an interpreter, taking the resulting SVG and pops it in there. It will do that. So that's just another instance of a tool. All the above. Yeah. So you say, I want to show you how to use matplotlib effectively. I want to show you how to write Python effectively. That is includes a lot of backprop. And it also includes a lot of curation of data to make sure that it learns the right thing. And then it probably also includes some fact-checking LLMs that are going to say, let me look for typos, let me look for, exceptions, that kind of thing. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So I think the question you're asking is really one about societal impact more than it is about the technological solution. I agree with you that it is rather disappointing to see the speed with which the internet is filling up with AI generated text. The interesting point on that, on the technical note, is that for a long time, everyone kind of assumed like, oh, once we hit this Ouroboros loop of we scrape the internet, it's made of stuff that we already spat out, and we just kind of are going to narrow the distribution of generated text to like, basically you're going to get like some approach some mode, and it's just all going to be some generic sounding GPT forever. It turns out that while it might be true that we are relatively low on fresh tokens artisanally created by human beings who used to be useful, there are all sorts of interesting ways that I started to hedge towards on how you take data that has been created by people and turn it into new data that represents a new way to train a model that is synthetic data, but is still based off of, a human underpinning. And so I think there's more of a role for synthetic data than I might have imagined 5 years ago, because historically in NLP, synthetic data has been a dead end. It means that you're training a model to learn the generating function, and that's it. So you narrow the mode. But the interesting insight is that the community is finding ways to take LLMs and turn them into data generators based off of human data that are showing it new things. And kind of exciting. So, but what happens to humans? What happens to, you know, all of us who get raised to lean on this as a crutch? I think it's important to recognize that it's a tool, that you are still accountable for everything that comes out of this. I think people should be experimenting with it in low danger environments. So it's okay to say, write me a Cinderella story. It's not okay to say, write me, you know, the introduction of my next paper and pop it in there. And you can find a lot of evidence that people are doing that. So I think it's important that people get experience with these things and maybe learn for themselves what responsible use feels like and what inappropriate use might be too. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, yeah. Yeah. Well, not so fast, my friend. A significant fraction of Reddit is machine generated at this point. Yeah. Because, you know, the machine has scale working for it. It can work 24/7 to generate tokens while you have to sleep and eat all these awkward, useless, you know, times when you could be posting to Reddit. So I mean, I will just make the observation that I don't have the answer in terms of like how old fogey are we being when we say things like that. I know that when I was in school, the graphing calculator was like this, wait a second, he can just get that to do calculus for him. He's never going to need to learn to do calculus. Could I learn to do calculus less quickly, but more effectively if I had to do it all by hand with a slide rule? Conceivably. Maybe I got further into the hard and interesting parts. And so maybe I learned calculus better because the menial parts of it were kind of done for me. And so I could actually learn the meaning behind it. So, you know, I think people have been discussing this forever. The observation I'll make is that when in the 1970s and before, an accountant was a person who had a ledger of numbers that they just added together, right? That was the job of the accountant. You were the bookkeeper. I have the book, you bring me the numbers, I write the numbers in the book, I add them up. Today's new numbers are this. And that was an accountant. Spreadsheets get invented. Everyone says, oh my God, accountants are unemployed overnight. We've just put them out of business. In fact, accountants have proliferated in the time since spreadsheets got invented because they have a tool. Yeah, well, I mean, ways to put them in a place where they're structuring, you know, making forecasts about the future of the business creatively as opposed to, you know, remembering to carry the one. So I don't have the socio-technical insights to offer here, but it's complicated for sure. Sure. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. So this is very much an active pursuit. There's a couple things that I'll note. One is that if you look at the trends in LLM training, and I don't know if I put this in here or not. Let me skip through. Maybe it's in here, maybe it's not. We're coming up to lunchtime, so I'm going to try and hustle through a little bit. The thing that I'll note is that the most recent LLMs that are coming out have been trained on more filtered data, less of any data goes and more of the high quality data. And so yes and no. So it could be like, for example, Phi-3, which is Microsoft's version of the smaller LLMs, is very curated. They, in fact, if you saw how I wrote a 5-point rubric for tell me which of these project ideas is the one that, you know, scores the best in your mind, they did that for educationalness of content. And they went through their scrape of the whole internet and they labeled every document with a score of 1 to 5 of how much did it contribute to educational content. And then they took the 4s and the 5s, and that was their training set. And the scores go dramatically up over same amount of training on more data. And so there is definitely improved curation that is important. There's also the ability to use the tools that humans have created to build data sets that show the path forward on things that we care about. So I'm going to flip forward, and this is a little bit of a thing that I am offering up as something I'm very excited about and something of an opportunity for everyone in the room. So our organization is acquiring an NVIDIA SuperPod, which is essentially like their base unit of turnkey supercomputer. It's an exaflop of compute at the 8-bit floating point level, which is sufficient for inference. It's 500 petaflops at the 16-bit floats, which are often used in training. That's enough to start training new models from scratch or adapting ones that exist. And so I'm very excited that we're going to have an opportunity to think of not, new chat GPTs, but like new kinds of data that need to feed these models that aren't maybe commercially viable, but would be good for humanity, good for science, good for cybersecurity, good for healthcare, kind of things that are going to move the world forward in the ability to marshal AI towards tasks that matter. So why do I mention this? I'm not sitting on 1 trillion tokens of good data. Does anyone in the room have 1 trillion, besides Ivana, have 1 trillion tokens of good data lying around? I'm gonna guess absolutely not. And so we're getting really creative about like, what does it mean to create data synthetically or with a human in the loop, but at the scale that can feed these things. So I'll give you an example. MITRE does a lot of work on behalf of NIST for cybersecurity. We have created decades worth of tools to help people structure information about what vulnerabilities exist in code and thus need to be patched. We've done an awful lot of work creating a framework where people contribute information about what tactics are the bad guys using when they are subverting your internet infrastructure. And so if you're a cybersecurity expert, you're reading these and you're saying, oh no, I run that same code. I should then check these next 6 steps to see if that shows up on my network too, in which case it's probably this particular threat actor doing this type of attack, and now I know how to defend ourselves. So we've been structuring cybersecurity information forever and building tools that help people do this by hand. And that's kind of where we are, right? Everyone is still stuck doing it by hand. So the observation that we're making is like, well, we've created a bunch of tools that allow people to structure information for us. We created all these tools that even let you like emulate a bad guy doing things on your network. Why don't we run that on 100 different simulated networks, capture all of the network logs that get created when bad guy X, Y, and Z are doing this, generate 1 trillion tokens worth of logs, and start to say, that's the basis by which I can train a model that will understand how to speak the language that the analysts are fluent in, give them tools that they can use to do their jobs. Same thing with reasoning. People are working very hard to think through like, what are good examples of how you perform, I guess, performative reasoning, like how do you capture the knowledge that's in a person's workflow in a way that is visible to a computer. So there's a lot of thought needed on these types of things. When I talk about like, why is MITRE, why is an organization like mine buying, a $20 million computer to build our own models? It's not because we're trying to compete with ChatGPT, but we do want to explore the full space of where they're useful. So like one example that I think is a cool one is right now, the Veterans Administration in the United States, which manages healthcare for millions of veterans, has a rule book that is literally 1 million pages long of like what is eligible for reimbursement, what process do you need to go through to get reimbursed, how do we know if you are trying to defraud. That is all written for people. And if you want to add 1,000,001th page, I don't know if that 1,000,001st page, does that conflict with the 1,000,000 pages? What an awesome question for AI to help with. So this isn't like, let's have the AI do the adjudication of your claim and tell you, no, that's not covered. Let's make sure that all of the policy that's written about how we help people who, need help is created so that it's simple to follow, so that they don't get stuck in a 1.5 year long process of trying to get reimbursed for things. So stuff like that, where there's applications of the stuff that really matters. It goes beyond kind of being like, let's do question answering. It's saying, we've written a bunch of stuff for human beings, and can we find a way to help people wrap their arms around it in a more useful way? We're doing the same thing with software. There's literally tens of billions of dollars a year spent like maintaining Fortran mainframes and like things that you wouldn't even believe. Like, again, not to pick on the VA, but they're running an electronic medical record system that is written in a bespoke custom language, and then also specialized at the point of healthcare for every single hospital. They all have written something in a language called MUMPS, which I guarantee you've never heard of, which then they like have their own version of MUMPS. And then we're saying, okay, well, how about you like write it in a modern language so that we can hire someone who went to school for real code to do things. And so, you know, how do you take that code and turn it into something that is modernizable, that can be worked on by people in this room? I think we feel strongly that AI plays a role in that. So it could just be documenting old code systems. It could be helping to kind of point out, you know, ways that you could write tests that capture the intent of the original. But there's a lot of opportunity to turn these things into things that benefit humanity if we think of really creative and clever ways to use them. And lastly, just, you know, you kind of, right at the end, everyone is going to say, like, this is all sounds so dangerous. What if AI takes over the world? Well, we do all spend a lot of kind of collected effort thinking about that as well, right? And as I mentioned, MITRE has a really big role in cybersecurity. And so we are looking for ways to engage with the community. You know, when someone says, what if AI hacks the healthcare system? That's a really nebulous goal or fear or risk. So it could be conceived of as, you know, either an extinction risk for human beings or like something that's utterly impossible. But like, how do you write down whether that's a real risk? So we're spending a lot of time doing things like creating actionable frameworks that say, okay, well, given that here are the tactics that people have been using for decades, here's the way that, you know, the next attack is going to get written down, because there's a language for describing how a cybersecurity attack has been conducted. How do we look at that and see what's a real threat that we're actually worried that AI might accelerate? Can it help you move, once you're on a network, can it help you move laterally between machines? Well, we've seen 17 different ways that, you know, people do that in the real world. Now let's write a test that says, does your LLM, if we drop it on the command line, if we give it a tool, if we give it a certain, you know, whatever, does it accelerate this bad behavior? And if that's the case, then we can say, okay, there's something to be concerned about. In absence of that, we can say, feel pretty good about the fact that the AI that is available to someone sitting at home is not going to be able to log in, you know, hack the hospital system and hold it for ransom. And so it's really kind of about finding tractable ways to measure these things, like what's indicators and warnings look like, as opposed to like, we're all going to die, everyone stop, or don't even worry about it. You know, I think there's a common middle ground, and to get after that, it's going to require a community-wide effort. You know, this is something that we want to say to the cyber universe, like we're going to DEF CON, or sorry, Black Hat, and like presenting this and saying, all of you who would think about how you'd weaponize LLMs, if you want to do the good thing, like help us figure out if someone's doing that. But, you know, in any given field, that's what I hope people are thinking about, is like, how do we measure progress? How do we do it in a graduated way that lets us decide if this is a net benefit to humanity? How do you steer it towards that? It's probably pretty obvious to you that I'm very optimistic in the sense of we can create tools that are going to revolutionize the, you know, the good things that we can do for one another. And so it's just important to think about how we keep an eye out for and guard against the ultimate risks without kind of letting it stop our progress. So. Yeah, I think that's a great question. I'm both, right? It wouldn't shock me to find that that everyone is both. And I mean, it's exciting to see that people are using them for things that they provide value. We run something in our organization called the AI platform, and it's basically something that just makes these tools widely available inside of our organization, a lot of open source tools. And we don't really pre-specify what you can do with them. We just kind of say, here's the ethical guidelines and rules. And we get back amazing stories of like super creative use cases. And so I think, you know, we've really only scratched the surface of what the utility is, but that doesn't mean you won't have a bad experience with them. So just experiment. Right. Well, so that's really what I was getting at when I was saying that there are clever ways to use tools to create data that is real but synthetic in, you know, in kind of equal proportion. So I don't worry about not enough text. There's always more humans. There's always the future. You know, most of the language that has been written was written in the last, I guess I'm putting myself out there by picking a specific number, but you would be shocked at, yeah, exactly. Something like the last 10 years, probably 50% of all language that's ever been written got written. So we're not done, but yeah, it just requires some creativity, I think. It is adding bias, right? And it's in the sense of hopefully good bias. In the, you know, like here is what a good story looks like. Here's what a toxic story looks like. That's a bias. So it's not the cultural biases, although those are a risk too. So kind of it's worth kind of thinking about the socio-cultural aspects of what we're doing here and how each model is going to carry with it different inductive biases for different kinds of content. Obviously, any new technology, you know, kind of if you kind of keep it in the hands of people who are very effective at using it for furthering their interests, that's, you know, that's not new to AI, but it is an additional. It seems to, yeah. But yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I think a lot of people make the argument that that's why we should be working on this stuff in the public sphere, right? You know, that's why we're working on versions of this in the public interest. And I know that we're far from the only organization who feels that way. Meta has very publicly embraced that spirit. And so yeah, I think, yeah, we'll see how it all unfolds. All right, everyone. Thank you for your attention. This was a lot of fun.
Okay, guys, let's get going here, I guess. So this is the space applications topic area. And my role here is just to do a little demonstration of an event camera. And the purpose of this is, this session is just to show you how the pixel works and show you what one of the chips looks like, and to set you up with one of the cameras so you can use them yourself. So how many people are here for that reason? You don't need to be here, man. You just go have some lunch or something. Okay. So how many people ever used one of these cameras before who are not instructors? Okay, so you used a little bit, so you have experience before. In what framework?
Processing.
You use Metavision, then you use Prophecy's Metavision, and you.
I've used Prophecy and
Yeah, also using Metavision software. Okay, cool. So I'm going to show you a demo in JAIR, which is my pet project. And then after a little demonstration of the sensor, you know, with some toy stimuli, then I'll first we'll get the demo. Then I'll go and explain a little bit of how the pixel really works inside on the whiteboard. That's better. I use the whiteboard, right, instead of a slide. And then I'll show you a chip layout and explain to you what's on one of these chips and a little bit about what it takes to make a camera out of the chip itself. And then it's up to you now, after that, to either play with one of these demos that's already set up in the back of the room. If you turn around and look, maybe they'll say what those are later. Yeah. Okay. And that's it for this 1 hour. And then on the Slack will be the links to install different frameworks, different software frameworks. So we won't try to do that here, but you can just go to those things and download them, because some of them are pretty big. Does that make sense? Okay, so let me do a demo here. By the way, I don't know if you can hear me remotely, put a thumbs up, or if you're even listening, put a thumbs up.
Yeah, can I hear you?
Okay, see something there. Yeah, okay, 1 thumbs up. Okay, good. I aimed the camera now towards the screen because I intend to use the whiteboard, which I'm not sure is shared. So I'll switch over to the demo here, which is running right now. In fact, I'll just restart the demo. Let me go out of the slides here. I have this installed as a, and it's a shortcut down here. It launches JAIR. And then if the camera, this is a Davis 346 camera, and it's running right now, and you see the events coming out, perhaps remotely, but you can also see it here.
I'm going to turn off some stuff that's confusing, and I'll change the color scheme so it's more human readable. And basically what you're looking at here are now the brightness change events. If the camera stops moving, all you have is some noise. I'm going to turn on a little bit of denoising so you really see mostly signal, except I don't have that here.
So Jer is like your interface for this, like.
Yeah, it's our software we've been developing in the census group for many decades now. It seems like it's the original event camera software that we did for all the sensors that we did, not just event cameras, but also silicon cochleas. And we've run multiple cameras with it. We did it to support the development of Caviar, which is the first big large-scale multi-chip vision system, stuff like that. It was all developed in that framework. But it's quite user-friendly, at least for me, because I know how to use it. Okay, but it's designed to be user-friendly because I'm a strong proponent of being ergonomic, at least for myself. So I did everything to make it ergonomic for myself and make it possible for outsiders to use the cameras without understanding the low-level hardware details of the cameras to some extent. So what you're seeing is that obviously if the camera doesn't move, there's nothing out unless you guys move, except for some noise in the background here. You see maybe some pixels firing here. I can zoom up on somewhere. Let's just zoom up. Even if you stop moving, those are you guys moving around, but now the denoising has basically gotten rid of all the noise. If I turn off this denoising filter, this simple denoising filter, the pixels are firing away. And what you're seeing is where it's gray, there's no events coming out. And when it's white, it means it got brighter. And when it's black, it means it got darker in that pixel. And you see there's mostly these white on events, what we call on events, because the sensor is hallucinating that it got brighter. And I'll explain why that is later. This is one of the sources of noise in the sensor. There are many other sources of noise, but that's one thing that's easily filtered out with a very cheap, correlation filter, denoising filter, denoising algorithm. So I'll turn that on.
How does it know it's noise?
That it's not correlated with something else in the recent space-time neighborhood. If it's not correlated with something in the nearest neighborhood, in the past 10 milliseconds, don't let it through. That means it's isolated. And that works great when the noise level is quite low.
Process manufacturing.
This one is Tower Jazz 180 nanometer, this particular one, which was fabricated, designed now about 10 years ago. And still is in production, In fact, we crank out wafers now and then. Now, let's look more carefully at the nature of the data here. By means of a recording of just a simple black and white moving edge, which I have right here. Just a black and white piece of paper. Well, obviously, let me show you some things that are beginner mistakes. Like if the camera's out of focus, it sucks, right? You have to get it in focus. Number one, get it in focus. Okay. So get it in focus. How do you focus it? If it's a Davis, it's actually quite easy because you can turn on the frames that are coming from the same pixels. And then it's trivial to focus it, even without anything moving. If you have an event camera, like the Prophecy cameras or the pure DVS cameras, then you have to have something moving usually. You have to jiggle the camera around and focus it. Otherwise, you can't see anything.
Have you considered having an automatic jigger?
Yeah, you have to add something mechanical there. Always expensive. Yeah, expensive and fragile. So you want to be solid state as much as possible. The optics are bad enough. Okay. Yes.
Is there anything like autofocus for these cameras?
People have played around with it a little bit, autofocus, auto aperture and stuff like that. It's the availability of cheap lenses, with simple interfaces that allow you to do that. Autofocus is a black hole of difficulty, by the way. Industry worked on autofocus for 30 years to get it kind of working pretty well. Yeah, it's not as simple as you think. Auto aperture is easier because you just have to set the level properly. But, nobody's tried that for event camera. But you can get auto aperture lenses, which electrical control. Very cheap now on eBay because they were used widely in the early days of closed circuit cameras, where they would just servo the aperture of the camera lens until the video signal reached a certain level. You can still buy those. They have a built-in control loop, but nobody really bothered with that so far because the dynamic range of these cameras is quite large. You see that now it's seeing inside and outside. I don't know if you can see outside the trees. You can easily see through the windows and see the trees outside. And it can see you to some extent. I don't know. It's not seeing actually your features very well. you know, the features on the faces and stuff, your face right here. What's your name again? Jules. Yeah, Jules' face is not so clear. But I could reduce the threshold a bit for seeing the brightness change, because if each of these events represents a change of log intensity that exceeds a threshold, either positive or negative. Best way to demonstrate that without trying to fiddle around with it is to put some sunglasses in front. These sunglasses make it 10 times darker, right? So this is like casting a shadow on part of the scene. This scene already has extremely high dynamic range, dark in here, bright outside the window. But I'll put it on a particular part of the scene. What's your name again? Sebastian. Now I'll put it on Sebastian there. Now I'll cover part of the scene with his sunglasses. And you see, it's basically it ignores the sunglasses. The parts of him that are behind the sunglasses look the same as the parts in front of the sunglasses. Do you understand this fundamental and very important principle? Even though it's 10 times darker behind the sunglasses, it's seeing the same thing. Why is that? Yeah, as I move the camera, the log and intensity change doesn't vary because it takes out the absolute illumination. You know, the absolute illumination just multiplies his reflectance, right? And when you take the log of that, the absolute illumination just is an additive thing. So that's the basic thing that's like most like the real retina, that it has a logarithmic front end. So that's the basic idea. Yeah. It's kind of invariant to that. Of course, it slows down a bit behind the sunglasses because it's darker. When it's darker, there's less photons per second. The photocurrent is smaller and the circuits run slower. So you do have this bandwidth dependent.
But when you're in a darker room, you still have it's more sensitive. Or at night, you see more noise coming from smaller brightness changes, or
yeah, it's noisier at dark in the dark. These cameras tend to get noisier. In fact, it's an abrupt threshold at a certain level of intensity. All of a sudden, the noise shoots up to a kind of a constant level, and that's a symptom of the way the photoreceptor and everything else works in there. And it reaches, and the darker, basically, when it gets dark, you have more shot noise because there's less photons per second. And since there's less photons per second, it's really shot noise. Yeah, it's really photon shot noise that you're seeing. Now, Jules, would you mind coming up here? I need an assistant. Here I have a cool little, this is cool because you can now look at the data in space-time. Where's my little fidgets? Here. I have one of these. You remember these things? Yeah, okay. So Jules, you just spin that in front of there. Yeah, I'm gonna make a recording here. Yeah, okay, just recorded that for a moment. Now stop it. Save fidget. That's good. I just want to make that recording so I can play it back now. Now I'm going to play it back, this recording. Okay, so now this is playing back that same recording. This is in like real time. You see it's aliasing a lot because this disk is actually spinning at like maybe 20 hertz or so. But I can slow down and reduce the number of a time. You see the time in the top left here? Whether you can see my mouse, I don't know. Where is my mouse? Oh, yeah, I'll put my mouse up here. Okay, see this up the top left here? There's a 5 millisecond. That's how much brightness change events we're playing back in this frame, because we recorded the time and XY location and polarity plus or minus for each event. And now we can play it back at any time scale we want. You know, in this case, I slow it down to like 500 microsecond frames. Basically, you can play it back. Is it clear? There's no frames here. In fact, just a moment, I make it even more clear. I play it back now in, I'll speed it up a little bit. I'm really proud of this because this is my beginner's attempt at OpenGL rendering. Let me make this a bit larger. Yeah, so I don't know if this is clear or not, but in the bottom, if I pause it here, in the bottom part of this picture are the events. Each dot here, which you can't see very clearly on that screen, each dot in this space-time volume, you see this is space in this direction, and this is time going towards the past. Each dot here is one of these brightness change events. You can't understand, but basically most of the volume is empty. That's the idea. Is it clear? You can turn that into frames, what you do here. And then you see the frames that, you just saw a moment ago, change the time of those frames. So they're more clear. Or better still, instead of going a constant amount of time per frame, we just play a constant number of events, in this case, 38,000 events per frame. And then what you can see here, again, are the events just collapsed into frames. Now you can recognize it because it looks like a picture, right? But it's very important to realize that most of the time when you're using these cameras, you don't want a constant time for these frames. You want a constant amount of information per frame. And one simple way to do that is to just accumulate a certain fixed number of events. It tells you a fixed number of pixels changed. Yes.
It's not clear to me why you want to have a constant information based on
Constant count frames. I call them constant count frames instead of constant duration frames. And the best way to see that perhaps is to play back another recording like this one of rock, scissors, paper throws. Oh no, that's a girl playing, waving her hair around at a demo. Public exhibition. Okay, here we go. Yeah, so this is, yes?
It has the benefit of normalizing for velocity.
Yeah, right.
You take the same object at two different speeds, you get roughly the same number of units for set distance. So if you build those frames, they are naturally robust to different speeds. So you can easily learn a model without having to worry about normalizing for that.
So you see, the faster you move your arm, the faster the frame gets exposed. That basically kind of controls motion blur. If the arm stops moving, you don't care about it, right? You actually want to slow down your exposure. In this case of trying to recognize the rocks or paper. So generally, you should think about when you're using these cameras, how you want to represent the data. And a simple way to construct very sparse frames is just to collect a constant number of events in many scenarios in robotics, for instance. There are fancier ways to do this. Yes.
Yes, short question with the fidget spinner, because it looked at least like in the visualization,
yes,
you could see more details when it, because you have kind of a shutter effect there with thing closing and basically opening, and it looked like you could see more details with this than when you actually jiggle the camera around. So is there anything? Is this really a thing? And are there any shutter mechanisms for event-based cameras?
I'm not sure. Let me just finish talking about this fidget thing.
Yeah.
First of all, a stupid bug with the drag box here that I didn't fix yet. So now you should hear, especially if I turn on my sound, you should ideally hear the spike sound. I don't hear it myself. Anyway, you should hear that pixel spiking. That's one cool. You basically put an electrode into the pixel and you should hear the spike. I'm not sure why it's not happening. Oh, I think I muted myself. Yeah. Well, you guys can't hear it. Can you hear it? Yeah, there's a little spike sound every time that. The important thing is that this is the dark thing, so the leading edge events are often, the trailing edge events are on. I mean, it's always from almost every camera that it's not perfect. The trailing edge is actually moving pretty fast, and it's not very bright in here, right? Right about like 50 lux here, or maybe 100 lux. Outside, it's like 1,000 times brighter. But anyway, things where it's not ideal. Just on event. In reality, you don't. Finite speed and stuff, they usually make a trail behind, which is not particularly informative. But still, you're basically getting a frame rate here. In this case of 200 microsecond frames, like 5,000 frames a second. It's kind of cool. I didn't expect you to get 5,000 a second. Not easy. Your question.
Camera was a regular frame rate. It's expected just as a reference.
Yeah, there are high frame rate now. I never use them myself. They tend to be really a pain in the ass to use because you have to collect this short burst of frames into a memory buffer. Yeah, they're really expensive. I mean, these cameras are not cheap either. They're too expensive right now, considering how long they've been around.
If you generalize the principle of generating sound to more pixels with different frequencies, you can feasibly turn even data recording into music. I think that'd be a decent contender for the artistic prize. If anyone wants to give that a go. I did. It sounded like weird. So it wasn't great. But it's still good.
Okay, so, you know, this JR at least has lots of different ways of rendering the events. Like here, the events are rendered in color. And then the frames in this Davis camera, you also get frames coming out. You can see all the weakness of frames. You can also get from the same pixels, like rather low quality active pixel sensor grayscale frames that are global shutter. Yeah, I mean, it's all the pixels are exposed at the same time, but the dynamic range is quite small. It's like 50 dB at best. But 50, by the way, 50 dB means about a factor of about a little more than 100 in brightness. 40 dB is a factor of 100. 60 dB is a factor of 1,000. So 50 is like a factor of 300 in brightness. You can see right now it's totally saturated. I can expose it, in this case, for you guys on the inside, right? I increase the exposure here to 40 milliseconds. I can expose for you guys on the inside of the room, or I can decrease the exposure down to like less than 1 millisecond here. You see the exposure at the top here? I can decrease the exposure of the frames to less than a millisecond. Then I can see the trees outside. I can't see both at the same time. That's a classic problem with linear sensors. But, you know, at the same time, while this is running, you're also getting the events from inside and outside. Is it clear? Because of the higher dynamic range. Now, when I show you the pixel, you understand why. It's rather trivial reason why you get this bigger dynamic range. Yes, Sebastian.
I've got a question. So if an object at high speed were to cross in front of the camera, will it trigger every single pixel that it kind of?
Yeah, so what you don't want is something, well, a large object with lots of contrast crossing over the sensor, like basically waving this camera around slowly, it makes the event rate very high. You see how this event rate here?
Yeah.
Which you can't see because of all this zoom stuff. Okay, it's recorded, yes. How do I hide this? More. Control-Alt-Shift-H, okay. Yeah, so you see at the top here is the event rate. If I just let it sit there, the event rate goes down into a few hundred events a second or 1,000 events, mostly noise here. It's all mostly all from you guys moving. If I move it quickly, it goes up to millions of events, like up to about 10 million events a second. But as long as you don't get too close to this limit and you don't have things flashing, flashing is very bad. Because then all the pixels want to fire at exactly the same moment, and they all have to get their addresses onto the bus at the same moment, which is not a good idea.
What bus do you?
Flashing like with the strobe light.
Yeah, but what bus is the?
I'll explain that a bit more, but basically everything gets turned into packets of data that's sent on this USB cable, and they get reassembled on the computer side.
And they send one chunk at a time.
It's complicated, but yeah, there are buffers. It's overlapped I/O, and yeah, there's lots of FIFOs on the way. It's complicated. Yeah, that's why it took like years and years to make the camera boards and, you know, logic to circuits and all that stuff to make it work. Yeah, it was a lot of work. Okay, let me, but now it's all compressed down to a little board. By the way, don't believe the power numbers you read in papers. The chip itself only burns less than 100 milliwatts altogether, running frames and events and everything. At the camera level, you're up to about 2 watts with the logic chips and the USB. You know, so everything else burns like 20 times as much power as the actual chip. You have to take that always into account. To get all this high-speed communication and high-speed logic is power hungry. Yes.
What are you doing like like black and white picture like from before?
This black and white edge that I was showing to it. When I turn on the frames here coming from this Davis, you see them overlaid on top of the events, but I can just show them by themselves if you want, or turn on auto exposure. If I show it to one part of the scene, it's not bad, right? That's not a terrible picture. That's actually okay. It's just that when you show it to a high dynamic range scene, it sucks. Let's try this place out here. But it's not too terrible either, right? But still, you have to, even that, you know, that printer over there is saturated. But, you know, if you look at the events from this and turn off the frames, oh yeah, there's somebody walking by, no problem at all. Yeah, so basically you don't have too much trouble with lighting variations using one of these event cameras with the events, at least if you, you don't have flickering lighting sources, which always cause problem. Like for example, the screen over here. Actually, these screens are not too bad. A lot of times these screens flash a lot. The exit sign is a classic example where they flash all the time. Yeah, you can see it here. This lamp is flashing away. You can't hear it well, but it's flashing away. If I look at this in space time, you can see. Let's turn off this. I don't want to take too much time here, but this lamp up here is basically creating probably this stream of events down here in space time. Anyway, probably just confusing you more. Yeah. So it's already past the time. I need to explain the pixel. Yeah.
Maybe I guess we can ask the audience whether rather play with the cameras or look at the pixel circuits.
Yeah. Would you like to understand the pixel a little bit? I can draw you a simple schematic of the pixel. Okay, let me do that here on this whiteboard, which I now practice with. Guys that remotely can see that. You can draw with your finger here. Ideally, black. Yeah, okay, so you start with, whoops. Black. Okay. Okay. In each pixel, which is a big array of them, there's a photodiode that's constructed from a normal PN junction, or in this case, a specialized optimized PN junction, designed just for collecting as much light as possible. Then there's a little circuit of 3 or 4 transistors here. That are, all this is running in continuous time. That turns this current I here into a voltage, which is proportional to the log of I. That's using the subthreshold Boltzmann stuff from Garrett's nice talk. So now you have a continuous time voltage that's logarithmic with the intensity. And that gives you the high dynamic range. Easy to get a factor of 1,000,000, 120 dB out of that. Okay. Then you have to, this signal, if you just made an image out of it, would be suck so bad. That's what the early days did. They tried to make a picture directly from this voltage. Problem is the transistor mismatch means that every pixel has a different voltage built in. So it looks awful. So you have to detect small changes in this voltage to turn it into spikes, so you have something more like a retina. So how do you do that? You basically AC couple it. So you throw away all these DC mismatch. Then you amplify with a gain of about 20. The change in the log intensity. I'm simplifying the circuit, but it's just a switch cap circuit where this gets reset to some level based on a reset signal. Forget about this here, the eraser. Okay. So this is the this signal now after this amplifier. Let me do that now. Who knows why? Somewhat mysterious how this thing went. Oh, I see. You have to pick the. I see. You have to pick the small one. Okay, you have to pick the small dot, not the big dot. Okay. Now it's clear. Okay. So here you have. This is probably not clear to everybody. You close the switch for a moment and then open it again. That stores this voltage here. Now, when this voltage changes, this one changes just as much. Here's the capacitor. There's no other capacitance, so the voltage just coupled straight across. Now, because you want to threshold that, you need to amplify that change in voltage. Otherwise, your comparators themselves, which detect this change, will just be, the mismatch in them will destroy the signal. So that's why we put this gain here. Then we send it into 2 comparators, which I like to draw like this, because they each have a function which basically just thresholds this. This one detects on events, and this x-axis is this voltage input, and the y-axis is just a digital output, right? So this is the on pathway, and this one here looks for negative changes, and it produces off events. And then this binary detections of brightness change go through some other logic circuits that inform the periphery circuits that I want to send my address out. So on a pixel, I basically raise my hand and say, I want to send my XY address out. You know, there's some peripheral circuits, which I'll show you on the chip layout. They acknowledge the pixel and say, okay, I've got your address now. now reset yourself. So this eventually comes back to this reset signal, which starts over again. Yes.
Is there a particular bottleneck here that would determine how fast the frame rate you could have?
There's no frame rate, yeah.
Or, I mean, how many events per?
Yeah, there's everything has limited bandwidth. So this chip will put out a max on a lab bench like 50 million events a second.
Oh, wow.
Nowadays, the latest, the manufacturers claim, you know, like a giga event a second.
Yeah.
Yeah,
What-
it's
so what's
digital
the-
circuits, you know, so they, you know, can do things like compress the readout, they can compress the events into. Like in each word of output, you can put multiple events and stuff like that. But basically, as some manufacturers are becoming synchronous, they say, let's put frames back in because you can make the pixels smaller. You choose a sampling rate like 10 kilohertz that you want to sample this. All kind of tricks being done. Yeah, so in the end, each of these just represents a delta log intensity that's bigger than some threshold. An absolute delta log intensity that's bigger than some threshold that's nominally the same for all pixels. Like say 20% change up or down. It's quite coarse change. Like minimum, you can set most of these cameras like 15% change. So it's not like a very fine thing that you can detect, right? But it has very high dynamic range. Is that helpful?
Can you adjust the threshold?
Yeah, globally. Globally, you can adjust it up or down.
Are there any constraints on the?
All kind of constraints.
Yeah.
Like if you put it too low, you just get noise out. You put it high, there's no problem usually. There's some upper limit.
Is at some point you adjusted the threshold? Yes.
I play with the threshold a little bit to reduce the noise.
Yeah, yeah.
If you get a lot of noise, the best thing is just raise the threshold a bit and also reduce the bandwidth of this circuit, which has a time constant tau here that you can adjust, or a bandwidth. You can adjust kind of the bandwidth of this circuit to reduce it, to make it slower, low pass filter it more. That will also reduce noise.
And how hard would it be to have multiple thresholds that you?
It'd be really expensive because you want to keep the pixels as simple as possible. So you have one global set of biases that you distribute to the whole chip. Anything you do past that increases the pixel size. So you're basically just distributing wires across the chip. Now, basically, there are three things that you can control here. The bandwidth of this guy, this threshold here, and one more thing you control is how wide this reset pulse is. This is called the refractory period. Refractory. In neuroscience, a refractory period is the period of time after which a neuron spikes that it has to ignores its input. It's like ignoring, yeah. You can limit the event rate by making this more refractory. If you hold this in reset longer, it ignores changes in the long intensity longer. So you're kind of throwing away information, but you can limit the upper event rate. I'm really constrained by time here, so. Okay. Yeah, so I generated this from our Davis 346 layout. You know, we did the Davis 240, Davis 346, which for a long time were quite popular because they really worked. You know, put out frames and events and stuff. Anyway, this is directly the layout of one of those chips. This is the pixel array here. This is a blow up of 4 pixels here. Here's the photodiode area. And you see all this other stuff here is all the routing wires and the transistors. You have some big transistors here. You see these big guys here? Those actually form that amplifier and those two comparators that detect the change in brightness. That's their big transistor to reduce the amount of mismatch. And then on this edge here, and this edge, you have the event readout. You have an arbiter here that arbitrates between different rows that want to send an event, pixels in a row. And then this dimension here sends out the column addresses for the pixels onto a bus here, which are just these pins here. So those 10 pins encode all the addresses. Then there's some handshake lines, request and acknowledge. You know, when the chip has a thing, it raises the request and then it gets an acknowledge back from the external logic chip. And then over here, you have this critical block, which is these digitally controlled bias generators that generate the voltages that set all the currents inside the chip in such a way that they're independent of temperature and threshold voltage and stuff like that. And on these two edges here, you have the intensity readout. These are the frame readout. And so the whole chip is, you know, in this case, it's about maybe 4 or 5 millimeters on the side. I don't know, you have to multiply these numbers. Yeah. And then this thing is packaged up, it's put in the camera. Next to it is the FPGA logic chip. Next to that is a high-speed USB chip. You write a bunch of logic circuits, to multiplex all this data together. You can imagine it's quite complicated because you're putting not just the frames, the events, and also the inertial measurement unit, the vestibular sensor, all pumped onto the USB bus into packets, optimized to get as much data as possible with the smallest latency possible onto the PC. And away you go. That's a capsule summary.
Tobi, quick question. And so from all of the pixel sensors, the signals go to the arbiter, and there is where you decide which one gets to send out the packet, right? But do you have some macros where you could access the wires of the different pixels directly? So if someone wanted to build a neuromorphic chip where you take directly like the parallel event.
Yeah, you can access, at least on this Davis cameras, you can access, at least the early prototypes, you can access directly the bus. I don't know, it's not brought out here, but some people like Greg's team in Western Sydney, they interface directly to these AER pins to get the data onto the FPGA board that's on the satellite. Because they don't want to put a whole computer up there and a USB chip and all that's fragile in space, right?
Well, the follow-up mission we're actually sending USB because it's more convenient and also
It's much
also some different reasons. But
because you can imagine the protocol to control all these biases is very complicated. All kind of obscure data packets and there's zillions of bits in there, probably like at least 2,000 bits of information just to configure this whole chip. Right? Yes.
My question, what happens when all pixels generate information?
At the same moment, you don't want that to happen because they all try to get put onto this bus at the same moment. And it's just not designed for that. It's not a good situation, right? It's good with natural input, where that doesn't happen. Like you don't like it with strobe light either, right? Strobe light is disturbing to you. So, this is for natural vision. That stuff doesn't happen.
You would start dropping packets or?
Yeah, you drop it. Either it's not like the pixels don't want to send. Eventually they send their event, but it's just delayed in time a lot. And the bus will saturate it, so eventually you will start dropping data on the host side. Right? If you just send too much data, the host won't be able to process it.
Would that mean that the time that gets sent along with the
It gets disturbed, it gets delayed.
Okay, yeah, it's delayed.
You can easily study that by just waving the camera around fast. You'll see some effects happen. Like the arbiter will tend to prefer half of the chip than the other half.
Times 10s are assigned to each event after the arbiter. So anything that happens before this times is that.
That's all the slides I have. How do you like that? 2 slides, right? It's good, huh? Okay. So don't want to take more time for this basic introduction. That's enough, right? To show the idea of the pixel.
About 20 minutes left, I think, is just enough to get started with getting a better feel for what happens when you are changing the parameters of the cameras, trying different lens settings and so on. So we have at the back of the room a bunch of laptops and cameras that are already.
All right. So hi everyone. Sorry to interrupt your interactive sessions there. It's just so we will continue now with one short, or actually not too short, I guess, a tutorial for the NIC group, and it's maybe a little bit kind of a topic you wouldn't expect because we're going to talk first about sampling. And then we'll talk a little bit about how to do actually sampling with the QUBO model specifically and the algorithm that we were working on last year. And maybe we come up with some ideas how to work on this, build something in hardware, stuff like this. But we thought it's important that everyone kind of has an intuitive understanding what we mean when we talk about sampling, energy, like why sampling is energy minimization, why randomly Ising models or Hopfield nets or whatever might pop up. And there's a lot of intuitions behind it that are maybe not super clear to everyone. So that being said, maybe a little reminder first. So we have this Google sheet thing that everyone who's interested in working on one of the hardware topics should sign their names into. It's overly complicated, so it computes some stuff automatically. So you can select what you're interested in. It will try to figure out which project has received the most attention, let's say this. So it will help us kind of narrow down what we should focus on. So please do that. But of course, I mean, if you have new ideas, add them, and we still have a couple of days to figure this out. All right, so
let's start. So I want to give a little bit of an introduction here. This topic is a bit obscure because it's often very, very statistical, and it's not very accessible, I think, to everyone. So I'm trying to explain the stuff. And if something is really unclear, just interrupt me. Yeah, shout at me. I will try to explain stuff. There is a bit of math in here, quite a bit actually. You have to do some math to understand why the thing works the way it does. So also there, if you feel you don't understand it, say so. And then I'd rather get stuck somewhere and continue later than rush through and lose everyone in the process, right? So just to get that out of the way. So in the beginning, I think, I'm not sure how familiar everyone is with probability theory and statistics. So we might have to do a very short primer. So maybe if you could give me a show of hands, like who here feels reasonably comfortable with probability theory? That is pretty much everyone. Okay, so then I can keep that very short. I want to briefly motivate why sampling is interesting in the first place. Then talk about how we can generate samples, and this will lead to the Metropolis Hastings algorithm, which is the most popular version of Markov chain Monte Carlo sampling. And then there's a bit of a cut, and then we switch scenes a bit, because this, until that point, it's about sampling of probability distributions. And the two things down here, the simulated annealing and the going into the neuromorphic direction here, is then actually more about optimization. And these two things are not the same, but they are related through this Metropolis algorithm. So the very brief background here to get it, it's a bit unfortunate here. With the, okay, so to get some of the terminology here out of the way. So we are talking about random variables and probability distributions. And the probability distributions have densities in our case. So we are not thinking of the discrete cases. We're not thinking about very bizarre special cases here for now. So just imagine, so we have a probability density, and this basically assigns to every point in this probability space some value. And what we are really interested in typically in probability theory is expected values. So you want to know the expected value, and the standard example of this is just the mean, right? The expected value of a random variable, you can also call it the mean. And it's just a weighted integral. Like you go through the entire space of this probability distribution, every point weighted by its probability, and you integrate, right? And so typically we are doing all of this in real space. So there's different ways of writing stuff. This one here is very popular, I think, in the more mathy statistics world. This is the one you've probably seen all of the times, but it's just this weighted integral over a space, and the quantity that you're interested in, like this is the x here, the random variable that you're integrating. And I'm showing this here because this form is something that shows up for the sampling stuff later, that it's kind of important. And so statistics, the whole field is about computing expected values of statistics. And a statistic in statistics is a function of a random variable. And the typical ones are, it could just be like x or x minus mu. It could be x minus mu squared, cubed, and so on, right? And this is like your variance. This is a kind of, I mean, this doesn't really make too much sense. This would be 0 in most cases. This here would be skewness and so on, right? So you can really think of it as like different functions that you're throwing at this random variable. And then the expected value is just the integral of that. And that's what most of statistics in some way is about, just computing these expected values. And so this is probably just, you should be familiar with this. If you work in higher dimensions, you can split probability distributions up into parts, right? So you can write a joint distribution here. So you have a random variable that's now a point in 2D, x, y, and you can write it as the x coordinate, which has a probability distribution. And then for each x, you can say how likely is each y, right? And so here in this picture, you can sweep across the x values here, and then you get this. So the marginal distribution of x is the thing up here. So that's for the joint distribution, you just look at what's the distribution of x's. And then for each x, you can see what's the distribution of y's that you would get, right? That's the conditional distribution and marginal distribution. And you can do this in the other direction as well. That makes no difference. And now, if you draw samples, so samples from a distribution are now just points, where if you look at the point, it comes from, so for each point here, you have a probability in the distribution, right? And so a representative set of samples from a distribution would be points where the probability of seeing a specific value matches the probability that you have in the density here. So points from high density regions should be more likely, and points from low density regions should be less likely. And then there's the famous Bayes rule, which is just using this formula up here kind of twice. So you write this is now something like a posterior distribution, as it's called, as a product of a prior and a likelihood term. And then you need to normalize this thing by what's in the denominator, and that's called the partition function. And as you can imagine, this is pretty ugly to compute. So that's maybe one thing to keep in the back of your mind. If you really want to have a probability distribution, you want to properly normalize it and so on, that might be really hard. So that's, I think, most of the terminology. I just wanted to show, like, if you work on a problem, like a machine learning problem, and you want to learn parameters that fit a specific data set, then what you're interested in is the expected value of the weight. So what's kind of the average weight that your data would imply, given some data. And you can write it out in this slightly longer form here, where you're saying, okay, it's an expected value, so we're integrating over all of the weights, but what's the probability of those? Well, you have a, and then you plug in Bayes formula, and you say it's a probability of the data given the weights times the probability of the weights, and then you need to normalize the whole thing. And I'm showing this only to drive home the message, like, also this inference stuff is about computing expected values. Like, everything can be written down as that. So what we really need to be able to do is to compute expected values, right? And so how do you do that? And this is where the idea of sampling becomes relevant. And so let's look at some simple examples. We have a one-dimensional distribution here, and we want to compute a statistic of that. So this is like x minus mu cubed here. So we want to compute the skewness of this distribution. And if you do this numerically on a normal computer, what you would do is you would chop up the one-dimensional space here into equal slices. And for each of these slices, you can compute what's the probability in the density function that you have here. And then you do the same thing for the statistic that you're trying to compute. So now you have samples of the probability and samples of the statistic. And then you need to compute this integral here, which then just becomes approximately a sum of these different slices, right? So this is a Riemann integral that you're computing. And this is the numeric way of solving this. And it works. It's pretty good. It's a good way of computing it, but it has some problems that we will see on the next slide. Completely different way of doing the same thing, though, is to say, okay, if we had good samples from this distribution, so if we, instead of picking a sample and then weighting it by its probability, we could also just draw a sample with the correct probability in the first place. So we just take a couple of points here where the distribution of these samples matches this gray distribution here. And then we just plug these samples into our function here, into the statistics, and we sum up those values. This is also an approximate way of how you can compute this integral. And so this is called the Monte Carlo integral. And this is where the Monte Carlo in Markov chain Monte Carlo comes from, right? It's an approximate way of computing the integral with random points instead of evenly distributed points. So, and if you have good sample points here, like enough of them, and they are nicely enough, like the distribution here matches what you want, then you can compute very accurate integrals this way. So the problem of this Riemann integral style, like this deterministic, you cut everything into slices, that problem really comes up when you do it in 2D or more ND, right? Higher dimensions. So if you do the same on a 2D distribution, you're now chopping everything up along the x-axis and along the y-axis. And if you then want to compute the expected value here, you now have a sum that goes over two indices. So you now have a sum of a sum. And if you go to n dimensions, you have n indices that you need to integrate over. And you can imagine that this immediately blows up in complexity. And if you have a neural network that has 1 million parameters or whatever, it's absolutely impossible that you can ever do this. For the Monte Carlo sampling, you just draw a number of samples, you decide how many you want, and then you evaluate the statistics on these samples, and then you sum up and you divide by the number of samples you had. And this doesn't depend on n directly. I put an asterisk here because if the distribution in higher dimensions, it's very complicated and it's a bit difficult to define, you might still need more samples to get a good coverage of that distribution. But it doesn't automatically mean if you go to n dimensions, you have power of n times as many operations, right? So that's a nice feature of this, and you can immediately think about, like, in a neural network where you have a lot of parameters. This might actually be the right way of doing it. And so I will actually just skip over this because we will talk about a different application afterwards, or maybe just a very brief mention here. So if you want to do sampling in the normal machine learning field where people use this, like in statistics, there's a bunch of specialized programming languages. They're not really languages. They're more like frameworks or libraries or whatever that are called probabilistic programming languages. And in these languages, you can write down like a rather complicated problem where you say, like, I have a lot of random variables. They have certain relationship to each other. For example, a neural network, right? You could write it down as a mathematical expression, and then these tools do all of the sampling behind the scenes for you. So what you would end up doing is you write, you describe a model like this, like you define, I have some, it's unfortunately a bit small on here. I'm not sure if I can zoom in here, but so you basically define your problem in terms of random variables. You say for each variable which distribution it should come from, and then you can define how these different variables relate to each other and so on. And then all of the sampling happens behind the scenes. So this is how people practically work with this sort of stuff. I can, if someone is really interested, I can go over this separately, like at a later point, if you want to know how people do this probabilistic programming stuff. But the point I wanted to stress here is this normally, everything that we are going to talk about in the next slide normally happens in the background. Like, you're not sitting down and manually deriving any of this. You're not drawing samples or whatever. You write down a model, and then the tool hands it off to some optimized thing running in the background. It's just, for us, it's actually important to understand what's happening in the background, because what we are doing is we are not going to use these tools. We're going to build tools or build algorithms that follow the same ideas. So let me just skip over this part here. So yeah. So we want to generate samples from a distribution. And I put a crude sketch here. So imagine this is a distribution, and you want to draw samples from this distribution, but you don't really know how to. Like, the only thing that you know is, if I give you a point, you can tell me what's the density at that point. That's all that you can do. So one simple idea is, let's come up with a second distribution that is much simpler, something that we know how to draw samples from. And we could now draw a sample from this other distribution S here. And then once we have that sample, we could add an additional step to our algorithm. And we could say, this sample, we either accept it or we throw it away. And so we now need to decide, is the sample that we drew from this distribution S, is it a good sample of X, of this distribution of X here? And now, without too much of like thinking about it, let's just say we define the acceptance probability as I've shown here. So we say samples that are very likely, that have a high probability in this distribution of X, we should accept them with high probability. But if the samples are super likely in this distribution S, then maybe we are drawing too many of these samples. Like, we are drawing samples that the S distribution likes. So we should normalize by that, right? And so we take the ratio. How likely is it in the distribution we care about versus in the distribution we're sampling from? And then there is some scaling factor here. And if you do that, and then you only keep the samples that you accepted, right? You only keep the samples for which A is equal to 1. If you do that, you can plug in the formulas. Stuff cancels out very nicely, right? So you can see that this ratio that you have up here, it shows up in the numerator, it shows up in the denominator. You can, at some point, like, pull in the integral and so on. You will see that everything cancels out nicely, and you see that the probability distribution of the samples that you accepted matches the probability distribution that you're interested in. So this method works. Like you can use it to generate samples from this weird distribution X. And the only thing that you need to do is you need to be able to take a point and evaluate how likely it is. And this is called rejection sampling because you accept or reject samples. And I have a short demo I can show here just to make it a bit more visual. So here I picked, yep, I need to actually switch to the other screen. Screen sharing is paused. Why is it paused? To see, how do I, that is kind of annoying. I might need to reshare. I'm not sure why it's not willing to. That might have been a privacy thing.
Yeah.
I think it's, oh, for me, I think it's something much dumber. I think I shared the PowerPoint window, not the screen. So no, all right, here. This is a distribution in 3D. I can make it rotate a little bit. So, and we can pick a different one. So this is a beautiful banana distribution. I hope it kind of gets across. The colors are a bit faded here. So this is a weird distribution. I have no idea how to generate samples from that, but I can use rejection sampling and I can just draw a bunch of samples from here. And I can speed this up a bit and you see like these points pop up. And the green points here, these are samples that were drawn and then accepted, and the red ones are samples that were drawn and then rejected. And if you look at it, it looks like it's doing the right thing. We can try to look at this from the top. Where is it? Here. So this is you see it ends up generating these green points here, which seem to align very well with the distribution that we originally had, like this banana-shaped distribution. The problem is there's a lot of red in here. Like you see that this rejection sampling, it generates a lot of samples that it throws away. And this is kind of obvious here because there's a large region down here where nothing interesting is happening. It's like it's completely flat, probability pretty much 0, but it still generates samples from all of there. And so you can see that this is really tiny font here actually, and Zoom also blurs it a bit, which is unfortunate, but yeah, I cannot read this myself. Let me get the window out of the way here. So the acceptance probability here is somewhere around like 25%. So it's like most of the samples here are actually not useful. And this is a huge waste of computations here. And so if you think about it, the problem is that whatever other distribution you pick that you're drawing samples from, it has to satisfy some property here. So you need to scale it up enough that this ratio here is always smaller than 1. So you have to make this denominator here with the constant c here, you have to make it big enough, because if this ratio here is bigger than 1, the thing breaks down. Like you're saying, I accept this with 200% probability. You can't have that, right? So you have to normalize it. And that means typically you have to make the C large enough that for the worst point in the whole distribution, your sampling distribution still assigns it a higher probability than your target distribution. And so the higher you make the C, the more of these samples you have to throw away. And it's bad. It's not, yeah, it doesn't really work. This was a 2-dimensional case. Everything is worse if you go to high dimensions. So this is to get some intuition, it's called like the curse of dimensionality. So the intuition here is like, if you have some volume and some other volume inside it, what's the volume of the space around it? And how does that change as you go up in dimensionality? And here I picked an example, like you have a cube. Inside the cube, you have a ball, like a sphere. And now you have a 2-dimensional sphere that's a circle, and you have a box around, right? Then the ratio of inside to outside, we just normalize it. We say we normalize this to 1. And now you're wondering, if we go to higher dimensions, how does this ratio change? Like, how does the volume of the ball change relative to the volume of the cube? And as you go to higher and higher dimensions, you can see that the ball inside this cube gets smaller and smaller, and the space around the ball gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And so it's a bit difficult to wrap your head around what happens in high dimensional spaces, but the upshot here is what we saw on the slide before. So in the simulation here, right? This empty space with very low probability and so on. This becomes more and more of a problem if you go to higher and higher dimensions typically. And that means that rejection sampling flat out doesn't work in high dimensional problems. So we have to do something smarter. Yes. Yeah, so if you think about it, so you have a machine and you can plug in a point x, and the machine tells you this point, at this point I have a density of 0.3, right? But now you want to go in the other way, sort of, you want to generate points. You want to say, okay, give me a point that has probability 0.7. For example, what would you do? Like, it's an inverse problem, right? Do you try out every possible point and then you see what probability does it have, and if it has, right? You're trying to go in the inverse direction, and very often you have this formulation where your model, like, evaluating the probability of something is easy, but going the other way around is really hard. And so for probability distributions, for example, if you think of the exponential distribution, like the Gaussian, like normal distribution, right? Evaluating a probability is pretty easy. You have some exponential function, you plug in a point, it gives you a value. But think about, like, how would you make samples be normally distributed? It's not so easy. I mean, you can think about it. It's very like a nice exercise to go through. But that's the essential point. You can measure probability, but it's hard to actually generate points that have a certain probability. Right.
So it's an assumption of this that you care about distributions with high probabilities.
What do you mean? Like you care about points that have high probability?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you have like a marginal weight type probability that you don't care about, how can you have that?
Say again, like if you. I mean, probability distribution is always normalized, right? It's always over all possible points. It's always integrates to 1, right? So if you have some region that you don't care about, you need to bake that into the distribution P of X. You need to say that distribution I'm interested in is constrained to that region, for example. That's actually something that you can do. So that one of the ways why you might have the super complicated distribution that you can evaluate, but you don't know how to generate samples from, is you might say stuff like, I have a distribution here, which is normal, but I want to cut it onto this weird shape here. I want normally distributed values only on this weird polygon here. And then it's easy to evaluate, is a point in the polygon? And if so, then what probability does it have? But going the other way is harder, right? Yes, I cannot see what's... No, this is just pop-ups here. Yeah, they are just... Yeah, and also for the people on Zoom, I cannot hear if anyone is talking on Zoom. So the only way I think we can do questions from Zoom is if someone writes them in the chat. And then at some points we can go through and see what's in the chat. Okay. Is this clear so far, or is someone completely lost about that point? All right, because now I want to do something which is a little bit hard to wrap your mind around. I try to animate it here to make it easy to follow. But this is the core point why, the core idea behind Markov chain Monte Carlo sampling now. So we have the same problem as before, but now we do one thing. We say, okay, we are generating samples anyway. We can remember what our last sample was. Like, that's cheap, right? We just remember the last sample that we drew. And now, instead of taking some distribution S that is everywhere, let's just take a distribution that is somewhere centered on this last sample that we had. So we are sampling now somewhere from the neighborhood of the last sample that we looked at. And if we apply the same idea, we could also say, okay, like, we can accept the sample or we can reject it. But now we draw samples somewhere from the neighborhood of the last sample. We define an acceptance or rejection variable here. And now the question is, like, what should this rule look like? So before in the rejection sampling, we had a rather simple case, right? We have two distributions. They're both fixed, right? And we just take the ratio between the two. And now here it's a little bit more tricky to think about, if I'm drawing samples that are somewhere close to where my previous sample was, when is it a good sample? When is it not? And so to understand how you can arrive at a good definition of this acceptance probability here, we can go through through a couple of steps that hopefully get this point across. And a lot of this is actually motivated from physics. So let's think about it. We want to draw samples from some distribution. And over time, we draw one sample after the other. And we know that the distribution shouldn't change. Like all of these samples should come from the same distribution. So now let's think about it like as a physics problem. Like this is some cloud or whatever, yeah, gas cloud or some liquid or whatever that has some distribution in space. And we know that from time step to time step, the overall shape doesn't change. But you might, from one step to the next, you might jump from one point in that shape to a different one. So you could, like in one time step, you could draw a sample here, and in the next time step, you could draw a sample here, and then in the next time step, whoops, actually, yeah, I'm jumping ahead here. So from step to step, you go from one point to another, but you know that overall this distribution here shouldn't change. And one way of thinking about like how could you do that is you could say, okay, all of the points, all of the influx kind of that leads to this point has to match all of the outflux from this point that goes to others for the probability of this point here to stay the same. Like it's one way of thinking about like as a flow problem, right? You have you could think of this as a gas cloud where every particle can move, but so that the shape of the cloud stays the same, if there is a lot of stuff flowing into one position, there has to also be stuff flowing out of there. Otherwise, the probability would increase, right, at that point. And so this requirement here is just the integral of everything coming in has to match the integral of everything going out. And there's many different ways how you could satisfy this. Like all of the points, they could rotate, right? You could say this point in the next step is going here, this one is going here, this one is going here, or some weird stuff like this. There's infinitely many possibilities how you could satisfy this. But one that is very, very simple is called detailed balance. And here you're saying, okay, what if the probability of going from here to here exactly matches the probability of going back, like going from here to here, right? So what if there's an equal probability in both directions? Then that the same has to be true for every other point in here. And if you require that, it does, like, it's not good there yet. So if you do that, this obviously satisfies what we had on the slide before, right? Because now the sum of all of these here matches the sum of all of these. So this is one way of ensuring the more general condition on the slide before. And yeah, this detailed balance is what you will find in a lot of, if you go on Wikipedia and you read about Metropolis Hastings, they will say, oh yeah, because of detailed balance and so on. This is sort of the hand-wavy motivation behind it. Is the argument clear? Or question? Yeah, question? No, yeah.
I just on the way to visualize it was to picture like sand crabs digging and then throwing sand from one spot to the other, but they never take any sand out.
If they're all like throwing from one to the other, basically. If it's matching, right? If you have equal amount in each direction, yes. Yeah, that's the same. Yeah.
Sorry, kind of not clear to me why the flux pattern thing should affect the stationarity. That was your point.
So if you think about if you from one step to the next had more probability mass coming to a specific point, then going for spreading out from that point, like I mean, it's okay. It's now I'm stretching the analogy here a little bit, but you could think about it like the probability of being at this point here is the sum of probabilities of having gotten there from any other point in here, right? And so oh no, I started drawing on here.
There's more mass going in than coming out, and the probability that can
yeah. Okay, and this is a very specific way of satisfying this. Not the only one, but a very nice one. And so now if we go a little bit into the formulas here, so what's the probability of going from one point to another? It's the probability of starting in that point and then going from that point to another, right? It's we start there with some probability and then we transition with some probability. And we can break that up even further. We can say, okay, now we have this accept or reject variable. So now we have three terms, like we start somewhere, we propose a sample, and then we either accept or reject that sample, right? So so the samples here are now suggested samples. And only if the A variable is equal to 1, that means we actually accepted that sample. And so just from this slide to the next one, the only thing I'm doing is I'm rearranging the terms. So there is this term here, this acceptance probability here on the right side, there's one on the left side, and then there is this conditional and this marginal here, and there's a conditional and marginal here. And we are just regrouping this by bringing the A terms on one side, right? And then it looks like this. So to recap, what we've said now is, in order for this probability distribution to stay the same, we want to have this detailed balance. And detailed balance means the ratio of these acceptance probabilities. So the ratio of accepting a move from X to S versus accepting a move from X to S is this term here. And now we're just jiggling formulas around. So this thing here, we want to now define this, right? We started out by saying we don't know what this distribution of A should be. Oh God, I need to stop doing this. Whatever.
Don't look at it.
It will go away. It will, yeah, whatever. Okay. So we started by saying we need to define this. And now we have one constraint, like it should satisfy this equation here. And again, there's different ways how you could define it to satisfy this. But one way that works and is very simple is this one here. And this, to me, it was a bit like mind-boggling. It took me a while because it's somewhere, yeah, it's similar, but it's weird, right? There's a minimum in here and a smaller than one. And it actually, it was a bit confusing. So I want to very quickly go through this. Like, how do we get there? This thing here, by the way, this is called the Metropolis-Hastings rule. And there's two terms in here. There's one that I think that the original one is this one on the right side here, which is the same thing as we had for the rejection sampling, by the way. And then there's this additional term here, which then Hastings added apparently. I don't know, like this is Metropolis-Hastings. And very often we will see that this distribution here is actually symmetric. Like we use, for example, if we use a normal distribution to go from one sample to the next, then going in the opposite direction would have the same probability in the Gaussian. If you center a Gaussian here and draw a sample here, it's the same as centering a Gaussian here and drawing a sample here. So often this thing here actually cancels out and it's just one. So then you're left with the simpler form here. Now, very quickly to show why this thing actually works. So we start by, we want to show that this, let me turn the laser pointer here. So this ratio here is what we're interested in. And now we defined that this P thing here, PA given S and X, has to have this form here, right? And now I just color coded it. So in the numerator, we have here the S given X, and in the denominator, we have X given S. So we just swapped the role of the previous sample and the new sample that we're drawing in the formulas. Everything else is the same. So I color coded the one in this orange here and the other one in blue. You see that these two terms here, they are just inverse of each other in here. You can try that if you just swap the X and S's around. Everywhere you will see that you just get the inverse of the expression. So we can just simplify it to this. So we have the ratio of the minimum of 1 and the orange term divided by min of 1 and the orange term inverse, which is the blue one here. And now you can do a case distinction. You can say, okay, what if this thing here is smaller than 1, right? Then in the numerator, we take the smaller of the two. So in the numerator, we take the thing itself. And in the denominator, well, if this thing here is less than 1, then this thing here is bigger than 1. So then we take the smaller of the two, which is 1, right? So we have the thing by 1. In the other case, we have 1 by the thing inverse, which works out to just be this expression that we started with. Hopefully this sidebar here goes away. We are patient. No. This one here, I will touch it. So, and now if you look at it, this is what we wanted to have. So we now see that the ratio of these two actually satisfies this. This was the requirement we had on the slide before. So we're happy. This thing works. Like the math checks out. And you can now, if you think about it, so what we just said is we have a distribution that we want to generate samples from. So what we do is we draw a sample, and if we like the sample, we keep it. And then in the next step, we take some distribution centered around that sample, for example, a Gaussian, and then we draw a new sample. And then again, we decide, should we keep it, should we reject it? And that is Metropolis Hastings, Markov chain Monte Carlo sampling. And just to show that, how that would look like, okay, I need to get this a little bit moved out of the way.
And just to tell, like, what's the connection with neuromorphic? The acceptance, you can think of it as a spike. Actually, that's what we will frame this as. And every time you're accepting a sample, that you're generating a spike. So there will be a connection between the two.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. So now we tried the same thing before, but instead of this rejection sampling, we will now use the Markov chain Monte Carlo sampling. And what I want to show here is, so just because it's difficult to see like these two different distributions. So we can, where is it, spotlight here? So we can visualize here. So the color now indicates, and this is a very small example here. So the color indicates now the distribution that we're drawing the samples from. And the 3D shape here is the distribution of which we want to generate samples, right? So this is the complicated one, and the simple one is the one that we're using to draw our samples from. And so now, as we patiently wait for this thing to rotate a bit more, I can also let it stop here somewhere. So, or actually, let's just keep it going. Okay, so we can generate a sample here. For example, Zoom really kind of over compresses this. It will get better if we see more samples. But there is a small spot here that you might be able to see. This is a sample it drew and it accepted it. And so if I keep drawing, oh, now it drew a sample that is a bit far away. It accepted it too and then centered the distribution around that. And so if you just keep going and you keep drawing samples, whenever it accepts a sample, the distribution will jump to the position of the sample it has accepted. And so this distribution now jumps around a little bit. And we can also kind of speed up this process and let it just do its thing automatically. And you see this thing running around on this distribution that we're interested in and drawing new samples. And it's maybe not so easy to see here, but I think you can already see that it's generating a lot less of these rejected samples in these regions that are very far out here. And now if you tune the width of this distribution that you're sampling from, the smaller you make it, the more it will just like stay in the same place over time. And the bigger you make it, the more quickly it will explore the whole place. And so this is one of the parameters that you need to decide on. And so if now I speed it up a bit, right, you can see that over time it really builds this nice like cloud where it's actually interesting. And so if we look at this from the top here, you can see that it's doing a much better job than the rejection sampling did before. And even more importantly, this thing doesn't suffer from the same problem as the rejection sampling did when you go to higher dimensions. So this is a very, very useful tool if you want to generate samples from some probability distribution. And we can also look at it, like if you want, like just for fun, we can look at different distributions. Like here, for example, is one with 2 peaks. And you see something that's actually quite interesting. Like the thing sort of gets stuck on one of the 2 peaks for a while and just runs around there because it's only going from sample to sample. And then at some point, it jumps to the other peak and starts sampling around there. And this is entirely random, right? And so if you don't wait long enough, you might get a completely wrong answer because you only get samples from one of the 2 peaks. And so there's a couple of subtleties in here, like how long do you run it? How big do you make the standard deviation of the distribution you're drawing your samples from? And a lot of stuff that can make it difficult in practice, right? But I think the idea hopefully is clear in where the benefits would be relative to like rejection sampling. So any questions here? Because this is, I think this is kind of like the main message I wanted to get across. Yeah.
Just kind of a question. So this is kind of in, I guess, 2D, like a 2D distribution.
Yeah.
Maybe scale it up to like the size of the network. How long do we have a handle on how long your sort of that little tiny distribution will take to reach sort of the parts of the distribution which are kind of...
No, it's very difficult to say that analytically, and that's why there's a lot of tricks that people have done that are much more intelligent kind of than this thing here. So people have then gone to what is called like Hamiltonian Monte Carlo sampling, where the idea is if you do this, you might really just explore like a small region, sort of get stuck there for a very long time until you do the very, very unlikely jump to a different part of the distribution, right? But what if instead you said this thing, this Markov chain here, why not model an actual particle that has a mass and a momentum and it's flowing around in space? And then you can say, oh, our system should be energy preserving, whatever. And then you can build a more interesting sampler that instead of just drawing a sample from based on where my previous sample was, and then putting a Gaussian around it, you're saying I have a particle that has a momentum vector and I shoot it in some direction and I let it move around in space for some time, and then I pick where it landed after some period of time. So this is Hamiltonian Monte Carlo, and then people figured out, yeah, but if I wait too long, maybe it comes back like a boomerang, and then I'm wasting time just, so I wanted to fly out, and then as soon as it starts making a U-turn, I actually want to stop, and I don't want to go any further, and that's no U-turn sampling, or NUTS for short. So there's a lot of algorithms here that are all like doing different tricks there. Yeah.
Purely literally, like on the peaks, there's not that many samples, right? It's kind of expect there's more samples on the slopes.
I think on that might be a problem with how like these samples are very dense together, and I'm not really doing like I'm not interpolating the colors here. So it's like for every point, it's just putting a 3D marker there. And so now if there's a lot of markers that are overlapping, you will not see that the density is higher. You should, maybe this is easier to see if you look at it from the top, but by now I've let it run for so long that it's.
Yeah, but the peaks, they are not samples that does that actually?
In theory, it should all be good. Maybe it doesn't work as well here. I'm not sure how it might also be that it's on my screen, it's a bit clearer because you can see with a higher resolution, like you do see that the density here is higher than it is over here, but it's like, let's maybe not focus on too much at this point, but I think at least if you go back here, it's very clear. Yeah, it should, like, theoretically, that is not an issue, at least, yeah.
You mentioned something about dimensionality. So obviously, as soon as you get to some relatively moderate D, these things will get very slow.
So how slow it is, so the dimensionality is not so critical for how slow the algorithm is by itself, but you might need, so there are other problems there. So you need to define the distribution that you're sampling from, and it might take much longer to get a good coverage of the whole volume of the distribution somehow. So generating each sample can be rather quick. This also gets slower as you increase the dimensionality because it's just more compute that you need to do. But I think the bigger problem is like, how many samples do you need to explore everything? And what you can have problems with is if you have, so for example, like one of your dimensions is very much compressed and the other is not. And you have this weird, like a distribution that has a very narrow funnel, for example, then this method is very unlikely to go into this very narrow funnel because like if you, yeah, it's maybe this is something I would need to draw, but if you have a region where you have a very small funnel, then drawing a sample from some point here that happens to land in this funnel is very unlikely, right? There's much more space around it. And so if you want to get into this funnel, you would need a distribution that has a smaller standard deviation, like the sampling distribution needs to be smaller. But if you do that, then it takes much longer to cover everything and so on. So there's a lot of these like hidden subtleties in there. This is why people who do this do nothing else, and they only do Markov chain Monte Carlo sampling stuff, and they don't intersect so much with other fields, I feel. But it's yeah, but these are pretty powerful methods. Okay. I have no idea how I'm on time. I'm pretty much. Sorry?
Almost 6 minutes.
6 minutes until what? Until, oh shit, I didn't want to use up the whole hour actually. Okay, I'm very sorry. Okay, sorry, then I could just keep rambling on. Yeah, we were planning to cut this into 2 parts and I was supposed to do 1/2. I see. Okay, so now we have now internalized this. You can generate the samples. Fine. Now complete shift in perspective. We can also, instead of talking about probabilities, we can talk about energies. And this is something that is a little bit too complicated. I'm not a physicist, so I also don't want to go through this whole derivation, but there's an intuitive analogy that comes from statistical physics that if you have a system that has different energy states that it can be in, then you will very likely find it in a state that has low energy, and in a state that has high energy, you will find it very rarely, right? So there's some relationship between probability and energy here. And the way you could maybe simplify this is to say, okay, so the probability of seeing some energy of a state is exponentially distributed. And so you have x to the minus the energy term times kt, and then there's maybe some more constant here. But this is something that people in statistical physics would talk about. So the probability of observing the state here depends on the energy level. And you can flip this around, and you could also say, okay, the probability of a state is then a function of the energy of the state. So the two are kind of different ways of looking at the same thing. One is just the log of the other. And in probability theory, this log probability is really nice. It's much nicer to work with that than with the raw probabilities. And so you can now take the Metropolis-Hastings algorithm and you can just rewrite it, right? So you just take the ratio of the probabilities, and now you acknowledge, okay, the probability here is an exponential function here. So you can also write it like this. You can pull the two exponentials together. And now the probability of accepting a sample depends on how much does the energy of that sample, how much does the energy change going from one sample to the next? Did the energy go up or did the energy go down? And in this case, whenever the energy goes down, you always accept the sample. But if the energy goes up, you sometimes accept the sample, right? With this probability here. And so, yeah. So now an idea that makes a lot of sense in physics as well. In physics, systems lose energy over time. They dissipate heat. And so if you just let them go, the energy goes down. So they settle in some low energy state, right? Which in our probability interpretation would mean if you let the system go and you dissipate energy, it should settle in a high probability state. So you could also use this to optimize. And that's the idea behind simulated annealing. So what we saw so far, this Markov chain Monte Carlo sampling, is trying to give you samples from the distribution you care about. So it's trying to sample everything and no energy is lost. It's energy preserving, whatever, because the distribution that we're trying to approximate is like is fixed. Like it stays constant. It doesn't change over time. But if we now made the same algorithm dissipate energy, we would expect it to settle in some low energy state. And so dissipating energy means you have some variable here that you just use to scale the energy, and you just make this temperature parameter go down over time. And this is the idea behind simulated annealing. It's also the idea behind a very similar rule, which is called threshold accepting, which is a little bit simpler.
It's not changing, just scaling them.
Yeah, it's like you're scaling just this energy term here. I mean, you could, if you want to translate back what this would mean for the, so this is in the ratio, right? It's kind of, yeah.
This distribution is changing. It's just becoming
Yeah.
takeoff. Now, because T is in the denominator,
So
it's going to concentrate on the peaks of the distribution.
the sampling, that's, yeah, so it depends how you look at it. The distribution from which you draw the samples shouldn't change. The acceptance, the probability of accepting the sample changes. You could say, if you put the two together, if you say, what's the probability of drawing and accepting the sample, that one changes. The sampling distribution itself does not change. You draw a sample and then you accept it with a probability that depends on T. And the T goes down. Okay, and so and this is something where I just want to show the picture. So we can take the same example here, and now we can say instead, we do simulated annealing, and let's see, something happening somewhere. I don't know. Let me start this. So let's maybe go on this top view here again. So we have some sample here. It's easier to see. And now we let this run. And I can speed this up. And you see here, there's a temperature slider here. So I can put this up. And over time, the temperature goes down. And what happens is in one of these points, at the point it settles in is actually one of the minima. So if you let it run over a while, it gets stuck somewhere. And if we go back to the 3D view, you see like it ends up on one of these two peaks. And so we can replay this. It finds an optimum. It's not computing a gradient anywhere, right? It's a gradient-free optimization method. And that's why people find the simulated annealing interesting, because it works in all sorts of systems where you can define an energy function like this. We can look at this on this funny banana function here. It also finds the peak. And just to show the equivalence, like what does it mean? We were now talking about energy. This is probability. We can instead look at the energy function. And this is now just taking the log of this weird banana shape function. Right, this is what the energy landscape would look like. And you can see it's a lot nicer somehow. The areas that were before 0 and flat, they are now not 0 anymore because the logarithm blows up these areas. So you have a nice smooth function. And if you start here, right, you can see how it kind of runs into this minimum of this function here. So it's minimizing the energy. And this threshold accepting algorithm, which is a simpler rule that we can also look at, it does the same thing. Like it also works. Yeah, I see people are impatiently lining up outside, so maybe I should wrap it up here. So maybe one point, and this was the idea, like at this point to hand over. I think we have to not do this. Sorry, we have to do this in a separate session. So we, from the last year's workshop, we were thinking about algorithms, how to do this in a nice way. In particular, how do you change this temperature over time? How should the sampling look like? How can you write this as a more neuromorphic algorithm and implement it on spiking neurons? And there's a paper that came out of this, and we have a draft of this on archive. And so if you're interested, there's a link here. Yeah, we can keep working on this. You will learn more about how this stuff actually works. I'm not sure when we will do the tutorial session. We will figure it out. Yeah.